experts in this room. When we were trying to come up with a topic for this year's symposium, we were scouring the ALDF, Animal Legal Defense Fund website, and we saw that their priority issue this year is captive wildlife, which got us thinking about the film Blackfish, which I'm sure many of you have seen, and if you haven't, do, it's amazing. And when we brought the idea of doing some kind of marine wildlife topic to ALS, we tabled it, and members instantly started shooting off some really great ideas. Shark finning, CITES, noise pollution, ESA, MMPA, all kinds of really great ideas. And we realized that we wouldn't be able to narrow it ourselves. And so Anna went to our VLS resident marine expert, Sarah Ryder, who gave us the names of a lot of really great people. And we started sending them emails, asking if anybody would like to come. And so we are now here with our really fantastic panelists. So I wanted to say one thing before we get started, in that there's a lot of issues surrounding marine wildlife these days. And we could spend an entire day on any one of the topics you're going to hear about today. But we thought that it would be more beneficial to have a few different types of projects explained and talked about so that you get a better understanding of kind of what's going on. And we just want to say that we're really inspired by our panelists that we have here today, and I hope by the end of it you will be too. So here's Anna with a few more words. Thank you.
Hi everyone. So I now have the pleasure of introducing our moderator for this evening, Sarah Ryder. I'm sure many of you know her as the Associate Director of Career Services at VLS and also a professor, but Sarah also has an extensive background in environmental issues, specifically in ocean conservation. Sarah worked at NOAA's Office of General Counsel, Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions, and the Monterey Bay Aquarium. Her work spanned research on the ocean seafloor to its uppermost polar region and played a role in negotiation of several environmental agreements. She continues to collaborate with her colleagues on ocean conservation initiatives through cross-disciplinary scholarship, which can be found in journals such as Science and Stanford Environmental Law Journal. So please give a warm welcome to our moderator, Sarah.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Liz. I was telling a couple of people this fall when Anna came to me with this opportunity, I knew I was pregnant and I knew I was going to be cutting it close, but it was absolutely worth it. So baby is due April 9th and we're hanging in there and we're here tonight. So I'm really excited about this opportunity. As many of you know, I love ocean conservation issues, and it's what brought me to law school and the work that I did before I decided to come back here and work with the next generation. So let me get my notes. So the lineup is quite incredible. I mean, talking about the people we have and the types of things we're going to learn tonight. I think it's going to be really interesting. We're just going to go ahead and get started with our first presentation, which is going to be interactive by Dr. Heather Rowley and Don Bauer with the help of some students, both 1Ls, right? Ashley and Sarah, who are going to be briefing cases. This presentation is going to be about the resident population, the southern resident killer whales in the Pacific Northwest, right? And what's going to be really interesting is you hear this presentation and then we talk about global shark conservation policy, is thinking about wildlife species that may have a smaller range that you manage and think about in a certain way to species that are highly migratory and aren't even marine mammals. So the shark issue is really interesting because of thinking about fisheries management. And then we have Professor Strong, who's gonna tie everything together with a really unique perspective. His background isn't so much in marine wildlife, but international ocean governance, and quite interdisciplinary. We met each other while working out at Stanford, and he's gonna be involved in the negotiations that are happening this fall that have to do with a new legally binding treaty at the international level on establishing marine protected areas, and some of the work that he's done in Antarctica, in the Ross Sea, with penguins, and how do you incorporate wildlife into kind of that systems thinking. So, to introduce our first panel, we have Dr. Heather Rowley, who received her bachelor's from UC Santa Barbara and her DVM from Western University College of Veterinary Medicine. She's currently supervising veterinarian for the captive animal law enforcement at the PETA Foundation. She leads investigative and enforcement actions in cases of abuse of animals in roadside zoos, circuses, and other captive animal exhibits in the US. And how many of you are 2Ls or 3Ls or were here this summer? You may have seen her really remarkable, she gave a presentation on the work that she's doing and then was also on a panel for ocean noise pollution. Quite inspiring. Dr. Rowley has specific training in marine mammals and serves on the advisory committee of the Whale Sanctuary Project and as a veterinarian for the Oceanic Preservation Society. Her involvement in the undercover investigation and law enforcement bust of the Hump restaurant in Santa Monica for serving endangered whale meat was featured in Racing Extinction, which highlighted her work as a lead investigator into wildlife crime and trafficking across the globe. So one of the things that really stuck out to me the first time I heard Dr. Rowley speak was that the Cove, I believe the documentary before Racing Extinction occurred while she was in school, and it inspired her so much that she decided to engage in advocacy. And I found that really inspiring to me and also to other students to really think about using your degrees and your knowledge and doing that in a way targeted towards action and progress. And then we also have Don Bauer, who's not only a partner at Perkins Coie, a mega firm that's based in Washington, D.C. with offices all over the world, but he's also a member of our summer faculty here at VLS, where he teaches ocean and coastal law. For more than 3 decades, Don has been actively involved in ocean conservation and marine mammal and wildlife protection. He has worked on issues related to right whales, harbor porpoises, belugas, polar bears, bottlenose dolphins, northern and southern sea otters, and orcas, and probably several of other marine wildlife as well. And if you're familiar with the movie Free Willy, you may know that the real star of that show, Keiko, had to be rescued and rehabilitated in real life. And Don was Keiko's lawyer. So he helped navigate that process of rescue, rehabilitation, and then reintroduction into the wild, which is quite difficult to make happen. Don is currently pursuing legal action seeking full public disclosure by SeaWorld of the health records related to captive life and death of Tilikum, the whale that was featured in the movie Blackfish. What is not part of Don's bio, but that I wanted to touch on, is that he is, I would say, single-handedly responsible for impacting the careers and the professional development of over 3 generations of law students and graduate students across the nation. He's truly remarkable in his generosity and his approachability for students to learn from and to serve as a mentor. So we're so delighted to have you, and thank you for continuing that process, and I hope you don't mind if I continue to send students your way. So thank you so much. Come on up, and we'll start your interactive discussion.
Sarah's one of those. She's a great example of a success story. So that's a little bit of a different introduction than I got for one of my recent presentations, which was on the Trump administration water policy. And that was a talk that I gave in Arizona. So of course, none of this came up, but the Perkins Coie reference did, and the moderator at that program introduced me by saying, well, and a lot of you have probably heard about Perkins Coie. It's been in the news a lot recently. And if you don't know, we have a very active political law practice that represented the Hillary Clinton campaign represented President Obama, and has been in the news quite a bit because we were the ones who carried the Russian dossier forward, and we were continuing to work on that during the Clinton campaign. So getting that introduction in the beginning of a speech in Arizona was not exactly the best way to warm up the crowd. I think this is probably a better audience to reveal that great secret. But anyway, no discussion of the Russian dossier in this talk. But I think we'll have something that's really, really interesting for you to hear about. When Anna approached me about giving a presentation and she listed the topics, my first reaction is, wow, that's incredibly broad. How are you ever going to be able to cover all of that in a single program? And I started thinking about, well, what is it that I could contribute? And as I started to think about it and listen to the topics, it seemed to me the best thing to do was to tell a story, and we're going to present this in chapters, that really kind of covers everything. And this is the story of the southern resident killer whales located in the Salish Sea, which, as you will learn in this presentation, is essentially Puget Sound and Georgia Strait in Canada. It's the inland sea that links Washington State and Canada. And in this presentation, we're going to hear a little bit of everything. We're going to learn about orcas, thanks to Dr. Rowley, who is an expert on orcas. She'll be talking about orca biology. And then we're going to talk some about whales in captivity. We'll touch on some of the themes and issues from the movie Blackfish. We're going to talk about the history of the capture of orcas in Puget Sound in the 1960s and 1970s, and how that led to federal legislation, the Marine Mammal Protection Act. We will discuss how the MMPA affected that issue, and then we're going to move into the Endangered Species Act, because the Endangered Species Act has also come to apply to that population, and in another very interesting aspect of the story, to one of the whales that was removed from that population, Lolita, who is in captivity in the Miami Aquarium. Then we're going to move into a discussion about the Salish Sea, some of the big conservation issues there, and we'll close with a discussion about what needs to be done to address conservation issues confronting the Salish Sea, the orca populations there, and the problems that are confronted by whales in captivity. So we're going to do a tag team approach. Heather will start, I will pick up, then we'll go back and forth. And because this is law school and we're talking about the Endangered Species Act, we've got some really good cases to talk about, and we've had 2 student volunteers, Ashley and Sarah, to help with that. And if you're not careful, we'll do a seating chart and I'll start calling on people. Okay, so we're going to start with Heather, talking about orcas.
Thank you, Don. Okay, how do I use this? All right. Thank you for everyone, Animal Law Society in particular, for inviting me here. I'm so grateful to be here. So I think I want to start this out with a conversation about who orcas are, not just what orcas are, but who are they? And it's a really important distinction, I think, because really I want to impart a sense of what these animals, what it's like to be an orca. You know, put yourself in their shoes. What is the animal's experience? So basically, starting at the biology level, orcas are the largest member of the dolphin family, so they are related to bottlenose dolphin and other dolphin that you see off the coast commonly. They are arguably the largest warm-blooded predator on the planet. I guess there's some debate about whether a cold-blooded predator like a saltwater crocodile might be bigger, but regardless, one of the biggest predators on the planet. Incredibly long lifespans, approximating the lifespans of human beings. And some other characteristics that also mirror human beings, which we'll talk about. But lower typically for males, around 50, upwards of 80, and even into 100 years old for females in particular. They're very far-ranging and deep diving animals. They routinely do shallow dives typically throughout the day, but they can dive relatively routinely up to 300 meters. All subspecies, which we'll talk about, a bit of how that's classified and what orcas are out there. Generally speaking, all subspecies are considered to have quite a large range, some larger than others. They are relatively slow to sexual maturity. So for females, that's around 10 years old. For males, a bit longer, around 15 years old is when they'll start breeding. And they only produce around 3 to 5 calves per female in an entire lifetime. So they spend a long, long time developing. And maternal investment in their young is very strong, similar to human beings. And that's partly because, as we'll talk about when we discuss their cognition, they have cultures that are passed vertically between mother and offspring. So they spend a lot of time learning from their mother, learning from their pod about how to be an orca. They also have a post-reproductive period that's very long. And this is unique among just really a handful of mammals on the planet. And it relates to this characteristic of them being highly social and also matriarchal. So the society, the Orca Society, similar to Elephant Society, is led by a leader, a female leader, typically the eldest of the pod, and she is the reserve of knowledge for how to be an orca. In that, where do you find the food when times are tough? And that orca is in charge, pretty much in charge of everything that the pod does. A lot of the movements that they make have been proven to be directed by the mother. And so these post-reproductive females are very, very important for Orca Society. They echolocate to communicate, to navigate, and to hunt. And I won't get into the amazing intricacy of this echolocation apparatus that they have, but these animals have a more sophisticated sonar system than we can create, than human beings have created in technology. So that's saying quite a lot about how sophisticated they are. So species and social structures. So there are a number of ecotypes, and don't get confused when I say there's only residents, transients, and offshore. I'm only referring to the Salish Sea region. There are a lot of other types of orca all over the world. But for this particular region, we're gonna focus on residents, transients, and offshore orca. And when I talk about an ecotype, they haven't yet, at least, been classified as a subspecies or separate species, but there's some debate on whether they should be, and they may be down the line. They aren't just different types of the same orca, they're actually morphologically different. They are genetically different. They are behaviorally different and acoustically different. So they speak completely different languages. They overlap some in territory and occasionally will frequent the same areas, but they never communicate, never interact. So residents are inshore population, typically around, this is the most heavily studied orca, and so that's what we know a lot more about the residents than we do about transients and offshores for this reason, but they are fish-eating orcas. And they're the ones we're going to talk about predominantly today because they're split out into northern and southern, and the southern residents are endangered and classified as endangered in the ESA. So resident orcas, particularly the southern residents, they feed on Chinook salmon almost exclusively. There are northern residents that feed on Chinook and other fish. Transients feed on other marine mammals. So transient orcas they have much wider ranges. They tend to travel a lot more. They will frequent inshore areas, so a lot of overlap with the residents, but they generally avoid one another pretty dramatically. In fact, we've seen resident orcas leave their critical habitat areas when transient orcas are coming in. And it kind of makes sense if you think of transient orcas are mammal eating, whale eating, and seal and sea lion eating orcas. So there's not a lot of interaction. Offshore orcas we don't know a whole lot about, but they do not tend to come inshore. They do tend to only be spotted really offshore, and they are also believed to be quite far-ranging. So like I mentioned, they have a matrilineal pod structure. We believe that's generally pretty across the board for all orca everywhere, but it's particularly strong. The degree to which it is matrilineal and the strength of that, of the matriarch in the society kind of does differ. It seems to differ. For residents, it's very, very dramatic. So every pod they can be made up of several matrilineals, but they tend to be related, and they're all mothers and all of her immediate offspring, and offspring never leave their mothers, male or female, their entire lives. So highly, highly social animals, gregarious animals. So they communicate by clicks, whistles, and pulsed calls. Each of these, not only do residents and transients and offshores have different dialects, but within the resident category, different pods have different dialects. And so they really show a strong culture between each pod that is transmitted primarily between mother and offspring, but also horizontally. So yeah, all of these dialects and all of these behaviors as well are passed on vertically. And of course, we wouldn't be doing the orca justice if we didn't talk about their brain. Orcas have amazing brains, and as we've come to learn, and they've demonstrated advanced cognitive capabilities. So what I mean by that is advanced problem solving, really amazing spatial memory. They have social cohesion, as I've already explained. They navigate, they understand. So that social cohesion and self-awareness, which are both listed up here, are sort of intertwined to some degree. So they not only understand who they are, they can recognize themselves in a mirror. There are very, very few species on the planet that can do that, humans and great apes and elephants among them. So that is linked very closely with social cohesion and also understanding not only that they are an individual, but they are a part of a pod of individuals and being able to navigate socially and develop really strong social bonds. So they have the second highest encephalization quotient on the planet, which is essentially just the difference between the size of the brain and the body, relative to the body. So second only to human beings. So that's believed to be an indicator of intelligence. They have, in their brain, they have specialized neurons that have also only been identified in a few species, human beings, quite a few species of cetacean, actually, orca included, cetaceans being whales and dolphins, and also primates and elephants. And these are believed to play a role in not only intelligence and higher cognitive capabilities, but just processing information in a very big brain, and also in emotion. And then there's a particularly interesting thing that they've discovered that Lori Marino, amazing neuroscientist who's looked at their brain through MRI images, has found a paralimbic region that is actually essentially almost non-existent in humans. So it's essentially a new lobe that exists in the region where we know in the human brain is associated with processing of emotion. So believed to be highly emotional animals, which probably relates to how they communicate and build these bonds with each other and connect with each other, potentially even more emotional than us, which I don't think any of us spend our entire lives with our mothers. So that might say something. Well, hopefully. So population statistics-wise, looking at the southern resident population, there are 3 pods, and only 3 pods. There's the J pod, the K pod, and the L pod. And if you look at this graph, doesn't totally demonstrate the decline that we've seen in this population, because it only started, if you look, hold on, you can't really appreciate it because the writing is so small, but the beginning of the graph starts in 1975. And this is when a lot of the surveys, population surveys of looking at this particular population began, and it only goes up until present day, right? So there's been a lot of peaks and valleys, as you can see, and these are population estimates for each of the different pods, and at the top, it's all of the pods together. And so where there's believed to be about 76 animals in this population as a whole right now, and that's across all 3 pods. But prior to 1970, we'll talk about in a minute what happened, which prompted the population decline, which is where we started at just under 76 animals, I believe. So as I mentioned, a diet reliant entirely on Chinook salmon, an animal who's reliant on that, of course, their life history, their reproductive success, everything is going to be intimately tied to the success of salmon populations. And we have I think there are a number of impacts on this population. So certainly, as Dawn mentioned, we're going to talk about captures that have happened in this population, and that is one of the impacts. And currently, particularly with respect to Chinook salmon and also toxic bioaccumulation from pollution in the area, there's sort of compounding to make it pretty difficult for this population to rebound properly. So talking about the captures, they really started in 1961 and went into the mid-70s. We're going to talk about 1961 to 1972. There were no federal regulations at this stage on this practice, so it was largely the Wild West. And there was also no expertise because the orcas had never been held in captivity at this stage before. So a lot of this was highly experimental, and not necessarily that dangerous equipment was used intentionally, but by virtue of the fact there wasn't proper equipment, there were a lot of injuries and a lot of deaths of orca that resulted from dangerous equipment and techniques that were just non-existent, really. So in the first capture, this is in 1961, the first couple of captures or attempted captures were by the marine land of the Pacific, which was in California near Los Angeles. It's no longer there anymore. They first went out and captured a female off of Newport Harbor. She was placed in a tank and she died, I believe within a few days, if not a few weeks, of technically her necropsy showed gastroenteritis and pneumonia, which can develop very, very quickly in poor husbandry conditions with these animals. But she also was self-mutilating by ramming herself into the walls of her tank. In 1962, they tried unsuccessfully to capture another orca. The team was unable to capture that orca, but did injure a male and killed a female in the process. In '64, the Vancouver Aquarium stepped in. They commissioned a sculptor. Actually, they didn't intend to get into the business of displaying orca at that time, live orca at least, but they commissioned a sculptor to kill an orca for use as a sculpture model so they could create a sculpture for the aquarium. The male orca was actually harpooned and then survived and was brought into captivity because why not? And he was named Moby Doll because they thought he was a she, so at the time. And he was exhibited at Vancouver Aquarium until he died about 3 months later. Okay, so 1965, this is when Ted Griffin comes on the scene. So there's a male calf who gets trapped in fishing gear off Namu, Alaska. This orca came to be known Namu eventually. The Seattle Aquarium, which was owned by a man named Ted Griffin at the time, purchased the adult orca and brought him down by sort of a sea pen, just dragged a sea pen along with him in it to the aquarium. And Namu actually was the first orca to really survive more than a couple months in captivity. He lived for about a year and he died from an infection eventually, but he was also the first orca to be used in circus-style shows where Ted would ride him and do tricks and things. Well, not even after, he was still alive actually at this point. Shortly after acquiring Namu, Ted Griffin and his partner Don Goldsberry captured a female calf in Puget Sound. And during the hunt, there was at least one other orca that was injured and 2 orca that died, one by harpoon and one by overdose of tranquilizers. The orphan calf was the first calf to be called Shamu, and I'm sure you're all familiar with the Shamu brand, which was and still is used by SeaWorld to this day. And there have been many, many Shamus, but she was the first one, and she performed at SeaWorld and was really the first one to live any meaningful amount of time, a few years in captivity. She died in 1971. And then from 66 to 70, Griffin and Goldberry hunted orcas in the Salish Sea routinely, using boats. They used seaplanes, perfecting their technique. Helicopters, they used seal bombs, which if you're not familiar are just the bombs that are often used by fishermen to deter seals and other animals from eating fish around boats. So underwater explosives and Percy nets. And it's believed that roughly 220 orcas were reported captured in these nets during that time frame. And to give you perspective, this is up to 1970, right? In 1975, there were only 76 orcas in this population. that really frequented this area, and that's just the southern residents. There are some northern residents. So, but there are not believed to be many more orcas than that are in this area. So it's believed every orca was captured, or orcas were captured several times during this process. So Dawn will talk a little bit more about this, but young orcas typically are targeted because they're easier to transport, they're easier to train, they have more longevity, they're just more desirable. Some animals were collected, some animals died, and some were released during that time frame. The most notorious of them is the Penn Cove capture, however, which, if any of you saw Blackfish, was highlighted in that film. It was one day in August in 1970 when I believe there were about 80 animals that they herded into a single cove and netted, and 7 orca calves were removed from the wild in that single roundup. As many as 5 orcas drowned during these captures, and in an attempt to hide that. We know this now from, observers, witnesses who have come forward with that information. But not only from that, we know that also because several months later, 3 of the orcas washed ashore, having been cut open and having rocks shoved into their bellies and sunk. So it was an attempt, obviously, to hide the evidence that they had killed orcas, but we know at least 5 animals probably died. And then one young female who was the last to be removed is Lolita, who many of you may be familiar with. She's still alive today, and she's literally the last surviving orca who's alive today from this capture. So I'm just going to touch on Lolita and the Animal Welfare Act, obviously as a veterinarian, and in the position, the capacity in the position that I do, the work that I do day to day. I really work on primarily captive animal welfare issues, and Lolita is one of those that I work on quite frequently. She is in the smallest orca tank in North America. She lives here. This orca tank is at the Miami Sea Aquarium in Florida. She's lived here, she's lived in captivity for 48 years. She's lived in here for the vast majority of that time, 44 years or so. She once had a companion. His name was Hugo, and he died in 1980. He lived with her almost 10 years, I believe, and was also a southern resident, actually. I don't believe he was from Penn Cove, but yeah, he was her companion. He died of a traumatic brain aneurysm, presumably induced by ramming his head into concrete in the walls, which was a relatively common manifestation of psychosis for these animals, frustration and psychosis for these animals. This animal, she lives with Pacific white-sided dolphins, and anywhere from 2 to 4 of them over the years. And these animals are genetically no similar than we are to a gorilla, but because of that, there's a lot of social tension, as you can imagine. These animals wouldn't normally associate in the wild, and they often attack her. They're known to attack her quite frequently. She performs in shows multiple times a day still for the Miami Sea Aquarium. This enclosure is literally what you see is what you get. There's no shade, there's no shelter for her from the elements. The tank's width, this is actually a medical pool at the bottom of the picture. And that platform in the middle is the stage where the performers interact with her. And that medical pool is often closed off. So really her enclosure consists of where she is, in that primary area where she is. And that area, although it's about 70 to 80 feet across, is only about 35 feet wide, and she is a 22-foot whale. So you can imagine a little bit cramped. So how is this legal? The only federal law that we have governing the care and maintenance of animals in captivity is the Animal Welfare Act. This act sets minimum standards of care, keyword, of housing, handling, sanitation, food, water, vet care, and shelter from the elements for all animals, all warm-blooded animals, so no reptiles and no cold-blooded animals, except for birds, rats, and mice, so any animal in a captive situation. That relates to animals, carriers, handlers, dealers, breeders, researchers, and exhibitors, right? So anyone who is engaging in any of those activities with any of those animals has to have a permit to operate under the Animal Welfare Act, has to also abide by the Animal Welfare Act's regulations. So it is enforced by the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, EPHIS, and there are relatively few species-specific regulations within this. It's mostly a catch-all type of law where kind of all of like, this language applies to everyone, but marine mammals are actually an exception to that. There are marine mammal-specific regulations. However, the marine mammal-specific regulations that are in there have not been updated for about 30 years. And, of course, we haven't had orcas or marine mammals in captivity too much longer than that, so a long time. APHIS finally, after about 14 years of announcing that this was their intention and planning and specifically conducting outreach to the scientific community for inputs on how to improve these standards, finally published a proposed rule in 2016. The proposed rule, unfortunately, after 14 years of waiting, was vastly disappointing and has been criticized not only by us and other animal welfare groups, but actually by APHIS's Office of Inspector General directly for being generally ambiguous, which makes it, of course, difficult for an inspector to go in and actually enforce the law if it's ambiguous. And the U.S. Marine Mammal Commission actually came out and with this particularly, so the one thing, although there are a number of things, and I'm not going to get into exactly what they are because that would take a long time, the one thing that is super, super disappointing about this proposed rule is that there are no improvements made to the amount of space that's required for these animals. And so the U.S. Marine Mammal Commission thankfully came out and said it's particularly disappointing since minimum space requirements are among the most important provisions for improving the health and welfare of marine mammals maintained in captivity, which of course we all know, because as I've already explained, they're far-ranging and they require exercise among a number of other things. So is Lolita's tank legal? And we've looked at this question extensively for a number of years. We believe it absolutely is not compliant with the Animal Welfare Act for a number of reasons. One of them is that Lolita has been without an orca companion. These are social animals. The primate provisions within the AWA also have recommendation or requirements requirement that the animals, because they are social creatures, have to have a companion. She has no shelter from the sun or the elements, and the tank actually fails to meet minimum standards under the Animal Welfare Act of space requirements. And I'm not going to get into a lot, we don't have time to get into a lot of the details of what we've done. I'm happy to talk about them later if you guys have questions, but we've sued the USDA on a couple of occasions over their renewal of the Aquarium's license, specifically because we believe that this is unlawful. So I'm gonna try to play this really quick. Hopefully it works. Just gonna play a quick video that was compiled very recently. And there's a big movement to bring Lolita home to her home waters in Washington State, and this was put together in support of the Lumi tribe. Let's see. Just play the first 4 minutes or so.
It's not up to them.
That's what's going on, sorry. We'll get there, okay. I think it's all right if it's just a little bit cut off.
She belongs here. She belongs to the Salish Sea. Not to Miami, not to the owners of that sea aquarium. She was stolen from the Salish Sea. She was stolen from her mother. She was stolen from her place of belonging. She was stolen from the place where the Creator placed her.
This is the Salish Sea in the Pacific Northwest, a region of North America renowned for its unspoiled beauty, pristine waters, and spectacular inhabitants. But here, in 1970, an event occurred that is unthinkable by today's standards. Over 40 orca children were captured during a period of several weeks, sold off like slaves, then transported to marine parks all over the world. This is Tokitai, the sole survivor of those captured whales. She has been living in this concrete tank for 47 years.
The most notorious of the roundups of captures of orcas for marine parks that began in 1965, ended in 1976. So the peak of it was 1970 and 71. And every single person and the residents along the sides of Penn Cove will tell us to this day that what they remember most are the piercing, agonized calls from all the family.
They devastated the pods. They took whale after whale after whale, and lots of them died. This is a sickening business, and it's got to be stopped. Yeah. And now to confine that animal to a 50 or 60-foot pen is inhumane. I don't know if inhumane is the right word, but it's grossly wrong.
The other problems, of course, are the very substandard conditions in Miami. They don't even meet the very basic requirements for the size and the conditions of the pool that Tokitai is kept in. She's out in the sun in Florida a lot. This is totally unnatural. One of the Orca activists went to the Aquarium in Miami with a little recording of her pod and of them talking to one another. He got down close enough to the water's edge, he played it, and she recognized it, and she visibly reacted. She listened, and then she started shaking and calling. So she definitely recognized the cries of her mother and her aunt and her relatives there, and it was apparently a very emotional experience for him to realize that this orca misses her family. She knows them and she wants to be back with them.
She calls out in the night. And the recordings that we have of those calls have been analyzed, and they are L-pod calls of the southern residents. That's how we know that she is a member of L-pod. And she still is calling out. That tells us that she has vivid memories and that she may not know she's 3,000 miles away. The last she saw, she was at the Seattle waterfront and then, put into a box. And she may not know, the distance, and she may think maybe her family is out there. She's near the ocean, so she may hear the waves and think, well, her family may come by someday, sometime, and if she calls, maybe they'll come.
I will mention also, in addition to the width of her enclosure being less than the length of 2 body lengths for this animal, it's only 20 feet deep. So it's not even as deep as she is. And that's actually at its deepest point. It slopes up sort of towards the edges up to about 12 feet. So yes, we believe this is grossly inadequate for her, and we need to do better. I also want to mention that she was 5 years old approximately when she was captured, believed to be around 5. So although she was a calf, still she probably has learned a lot of her dialect and retains a lot of her culture from the L-pod. So particularly, it's sad regardless, but let me get your PowerPoint back up.
We'll come back to this video. There's another aspect of it that we'll watch later on.
Do you want to use the?
Okay, chapter 4. We left the story off in 1970 with the Penn Cove captures. Those were highly visible captures. The public saw everything that was happening in conjunction with those. They were very well advertised. So the public outcry against those captures was one of the factors that led Congress in 1972 to enact the Marine Mammal Protection Act. One of the key components of the MMPA was to kick the states out of any legal role in managing marine mammals for purposes of addressing what constituted take. And what was happening in Washington State was one example of why that was important. Could not have all the 50 states, or all the states on the coastline, having independent roles and separate laws to govern what happens with marine mammals. The primary purpose of the MMPA is to promote the health and stability of the marine ecosystem, and when consistent with that goal, to achieve population status objectives for species, subspecies, and population stocks of marine mammals. The key action forcing tool in the MMPA is the moratorium on take and the prohibition on take and import. The term take in the MMPA is defined as to harass, hunt, capture, or kill any marine mammal. Keep that definition in mind because we're going to look at another definition of take under the Endangered Species Act. When Congress enacted the MMPA and established the prohibition on taking, it also established a series of exceptions. One of those exceptions was to capture marine mammals for purposes of putting them on public display. To be able to do that, it was necessary to get a permit. And it was really the Penn Cove captures that drove the development of that permit requirement in the MMPA and then the way that the process would be applied. So as soon as the MMPA was enacted, 2 permit applications were filed, one by SeaWorld and one by the Seattle Marine Aquarium. SeaWorld's permit asked to capture 4 animals for the facility that it was then developing in Florida, in Orlando, which is there today and does have orcas maintained at it. The Seattle Aquarium asked for authorization to take 8 orcas, 2 of them that would stay at the Seattle Aquarium, 6 of which were then going to be sold. These permit applications were incredibly controversial. They generated very strong opposition. The issue got very political. The governor of the state of Washington came out strongly opposed to the permits. Senator Magnuson was also strongly opposed to the permits. Both of them insisted on a very visible public comment and hearing process to evaluate whether or not the permits should be issued. The first hearings that took place in Seattle produced such a public outcry against the Seattle Aquarium permit that they dropped the application. SeaWorld went forward. The National Marine Fisheries Service, which under the MMPA has jurisdiction over whales, issued the permit in 1974. That led to an immediate lawsuit. In that lawsuit, the plaintiffs were able to get, the state of Washington actually brought the lawsuits. At that time, Slade Gorton, who later became a senator for the state of Washington, was the attorney general. He brought the lawsuit against the National Marine Fisheries Service and against Goldsberry, who was the individual who received the permit on behalf of SeaWorld to do the collection. The state of Washington was successful in getting a temporary restraining order against the permit being implemented, but that was not until SeaWorld had successfully captured orcas and was maintaining them in a netted off area in Puget Sound. SeaWorld immediately appealed to and the National Marine Fisheries Service immediately appealed to the Ninth Circuit. The district court judge, in addition to issuing a TRO against the removal of the whales from their capture site to be placed in captivity, had then issued an order that they should be released. The Ninth Circuit overturned the district court on the release issue and said that we need more information about what's happening with these whales before we can make a decision whether they should be removed from the wild and from their capture site to be placed in captivity in SeaWorld. While they were being held there, they actually captured 6 whales. 3 of them escaped, and the other 3, it turns out, were too small. They did not meet the standard requirements that were in the permit, so they had to be let go. But what came out as one of the consequences of the permits was a requirement to do surveys. These surveys began in 1976. The table that we saw earlier shows that at that time, the population stood at about 71 animals. Once the captures were stopped, if you recall that graph, and we'll see it again later, the population began to grow and eventually reached into the 90s. That population level, though, has begun to decline. SeaWorld, in its original permit application, because there was no real evidence, there was no way to challenge this, said that there were multiple pods of 200, there were thousands of orcas in the Salish Sea and in the Pacific waters off the coasts of Washington and Canada, therefore there would be no population impacts. During that period of time, the number is a little uncertain, 39, 40, 41 animals were removed from the Washington population. That's a huge impact on what turned out to be the actual size of the southern resident killer whale population. So the initial survey determined that there were 71 whales that were in that population in Puget Sound. So that brings us to the Endangered Species Act. Enacted a year after the Marine Mammal Protection Act, also has a focus on ecosystems and at bringing species that are listed under the ESA to a point where they can be removed from the protections of the Act. The ESA sets forth a petition process where any party can put together evidence, submit it to, in the case of whales, the National Marine Fisheries Service for a determination whether the species should be listed. And it breaks down listing into 3 different categories: species, subspecies, or what's called a distinct population stock. And in addition to listing, critical habitat for the species is supposed to be designated at the same time as a listing decision. It very seldom is. So that brings us to our first case, Center for Biological Diversity v. Lawn. This is a case that addressed the petition to list the southern resident killer whales that was filed by the Center for Biological Diversity. So Sarah, why don't you tell us what happened in this case?
Sure, absolutely. So the case is obviously Center for Biological Diversity v. Lone. And the Center for Biological Diversity, just kind of as a starting point, is a nonprofit that's focused on saving species from extinction. And then Lon was Robert Lon, who was the Northwest Regional Administrator for the National Marine Fisheries Service. This case was heard in the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Washington in 2003, but the case really started in 2001 with the Center for Biological Diversity's petition to have the southern resident killer whales listed as an endangered species. As we've heard, the population was declining based on captures and kills, so they were really concerned with the declining population and wanted the southern resident killer whales listed as endangered. So, as Don talked about briefly, the endangered classification is defined by the Endangered Species Act as one which is in danger of extinction throughout all or significant portion of its range, and that's can be found in 16 U.S.C. section 1532(6) for anyone who's interested in looking into more of that. And particularly, they were worried about this distinct population segment, which is a segment of any species of vertebrate fish or wildlife which interbreeds when mature. And at issue, like I said, was this distinct population. The National Marine Fisheries Services determined that because the southern resident killer whales were not a distinct population segment, they didn't warrant the endangered classification. And while the ESA does not define what a distinct population segment is, the NMFS and the Fish and Wildlife Service clarified their understanding in a 1996 report. There they stated that a distinct population segment is evaluated according to 3 elements. The first being the discreteness of the population segment in relation to the remainder of the population, or of the species to which it belongs. The second is the significance of the population segment to the species to which it belongs. And then finally, the population segment's conservation status in relation to the Act standards. And the NMFS took particular issue with the significance portion of the elements, finding that the southern resident killer whales were not significant in terms of their relationship to the population of orcas in general. The plaintiffs, however, contended that the NMFS decided this issue based on outdated science, which stated that orcas were one species with no, as Heather mentioned, ecotypes or subgroups. But that, as we've seen, is not correct. So the plaintiffs argued that they are distinct from other populations like the transient and offshore killer whales because they have their own social structure, customs, and language. Ultimately, the court agreed with the plaintiffs that the NMFS had likely based their conclusion on outdated science, but because the courts wanted to defer to the government agency, they also assumed that this ultimate finding that the southern resident killer whales did not warrant endangered species status was not necessarily incorrect. And further, while the court remanded the case for the NMFS to review the test for significance, the court decided that the test wasn't inherently arbitrary or capricious. Ultimately, the NMFS did decide that they suggested that the southern resident killer whales be listed as threatened, but after a period of public comment, they did provide the southern resident killer whales the endangered species status.
So just one quick question on that. In that case, did you see, was there a tension between what the scientists for the agency said and then what the political appointees for the agency decided, and what happened with that? Why was that the case?
Yeah, absolutely. The scientists were saying very clearly, like as we heard earlier, that the southern resident killer whales are completely different from these different subgroups or ecotypes, and that they should not, to say that orcas are one species is completely incorrect and should not be based, the basis for such, for not giving them the endangered species status, while the government agency decided that they wanted to use different science. And I think the court was just worried because this was the first time really that they had looked at, from my understanding, how exactly to define the distinct population segment, that they were more willing to give the agency some leeway and discretion in how they were going to decide what that meant and what science they could use.
Okay, so not the first or last time we've seen the scientists for an agency reach a conclusion about what should happen under the Endangered Species Act to essentially be overturned at the policy level. There was huge political pressure brought to bear not to list the southern residents, and it took the court to say, go back and do it over again because your finding does not match what your scientists are saying. Critical habitat was designated in 2006. As you can see, it's pretty much all of the Salish Sea area. The Endangered Species Act has a take prohibition. The definition is quite a bit longer than the definition of the MMPA, and it includes the important element of harm. In addition to prohibiting take, the Endangered Species Act prohibits any federal actions that would cause jeopardy to the species or adversely modify or destroy critical habitat. So that's a test that every federal action will trigger and has to pass through if it is going to have a may effect on a listed species. So how does this relate to Lolita? Ashley, why don't you tell us what happened in this very recent court decision?
Okay, so this case is the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals versus the Miami Aquarium, and it's a case about statutory construction in the Endangered Species Act. In 2015, PETA brought a suit against the Miami Aquarium, alleging the unlawful take of the 51-year-old Lolita, who is a southern residential killer whale. Like we talked about earlier, Lolita was captured off the coast of Washington State when she was about 5 years old, and she's lived at this aquarium since September 24th of 1970. Lolita is now 51 years old and lives in an oblong tank about 35 feet wide by 20 feet deep. And she lives with Pacific white-sided dolphins. And PETA cited 13 separate injuries that were attributed to the configuration of her tank, the dolphins that Lolita shares her tank with, and the sun exposure, and then any combination of those mentioned. PETA argues that Lolita is being harmed and harassed consistent with Section 9 of the Endangered Species Act. And Section 9 protects an enumerated list of fish and wildlife species and makes it unlawful for an individual to take any such species within the United States or the territorial seas of the United States and take means to harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, or collect, or an attempt to engage in any such conduct. So typically the common usage of a word's meaning is used to understand the statutory definition. However, in this case, the common meaning did not help the court determine what degree of harm or harassment was actionable because of their broad dictionary definitions. So the court reasoned that in this case, the court should use the Noscitur Associus canon for assistance. And the Noscitur Associus canon is the idea that a word is known by the company that it keeps. So in this case, the court noted that each term accompanying harm and harass refers to conduct that poses a threat of serious harm to endangered species. The court concluded that harm and harass should be read as referring to conduct that poses a similarly serious threat. The court suggested that no further inquiry was needed because the common usage, as informed by the application of Noscitur Associus, revealed that harm and harass have a plain and unambiguous meaning with regard to this particular dispute. PETA argued that the court should read harm and harass as broad to stay consistent with the Supreme Court's broad interpretation of the Endangered Species Act's purpose. However, the court suggested that the narrow interpretation of harm and harassment is more reflective of ESA's purpose, which is to conserve, because conservation is aimed to stop and reverse species extinction. Congress is likely intended for protection against actions that pose a serious threat or harm because of the purpose of the Endangered Species Act. So the Animal Welfare Act and APHIS, which is the Administrator of Animal and Plant Health Inspection Services, have established a detailed set of regulations governing the humane handling, care, treatment, and transportation of marine mammals used for exhibition purposes. If the court interpreted harm and harass by their dictionary definitions, the interpretation could nullify the Animal Welfare Act's regime of administrative enforcement by framing virtually any condition as impermissible. An example the court used of this was if APHIS approved a captive endangered marine mammal's companion, a plaintiff could invite federal court to substitute its judgment for APHIS by bringing an ESA lawsuit characterizing the chosen companion as a continual annoyance. So in short, the court stated that harm and harass is actionable if it poses a threat of serious harm. This provides captive endangered animals with an additional layer of protection from harmful conduct without dismantling the complex regulatory scheme crafted and administered by APHIS.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. So that case is currently, there's a petition for rehearing that's currently pending with the 11th Circuit. It's been pending for quite some time, so that indicates that they're giving it a close look. I think the Circuit Court got it wrong, that they should not have set this elevated standard, and that they incorrectly applied some of the statutory interpretation tools that were cited, and did so, in fact, contrary to guidance that had come out from the U.S. Supreme Court in the Sweet Home decision. So let's talk about the Salish Sea for a few minutes. I'm going to go through this very quickly. The Salish Sea is the home of the southern resident killer whale population. They are the signature species in the Salish Sea, and what is happening to them is very indicative of what's happening to the entire Salish Sea ecosystem. This area is under significant threats from a variety of different factors. issues with water quality. There is a very significant problem with the runoff pollution that is making its way into the Salish Sea and is having a very negative effect on water quality, diversion and impoundments. There are so many dams on rivers, 17 major rivers that empty into the Salish Sea, that they are impeding the passage of Chinook salmon, which, as we have heard, is the key prey species for killer whales. Toxic bioaccumulation is a major problem that's becoming evident in the orcas as the top of the food chain. Another significant threat to orcas in the Salish Sea is from shipping noise and strikes that's causing that, interfering with their echolocation abilities. What do we do about the Salish Sea? I'm not going to run through all these factors. Suffice it to say that there's a very significant effort underway between the United States and Canada. Not so much at the federal level right now in the United States, but up until the election that had been the case, there was a very active NGO effort underway to address these different factors that have been affecting the Salish Sea, and most importantly, to have it designated as a single marine protected area that bridges the two countries and provides additional protections to address these factors that are causing the decline of the Salish Sea and of the southern resident killer whale population. So go back to whales in captivity.
Yeah, just to wrap up this section, I'm gonna play like just 2 more minutes of this video for you. Really quick.
The Lummi Nation has shared the Salish Sea with orca whales for more than 10,000 years. The Lummis consider orcas members of their tribe and are committed to bringing Tokitai home to swim with her original pod and her mother.
The aim is to bring her home in order to achieve that larger aim of the Salish Sea, because it is the highway of a lifeway for Native peoples, and not just Native peoples, all the people of the Salish Sea bioregion.
Creator willing, you know, together we can make this happen for her and for her pod and her mother and for our people, the people of the Salish Sea.
This is Glenwood Springs Salmon Hatchery on Orcas Island in the Salish Sea. A 100-acre cove is being prepared for the day when Tokitai returns to her home waters. She will be gradually reintroduced into her native environment, receiving veterinary care from handlers she knows and trusts. The hatchery will provide her plenty of Chinook salmon as she learns to catch her own, and the site is strategically located. Her native L-pod swims past the cove often in their normal jaunts around the islands. Will she hear her mother's calls? Only time will tell.
The big challenge to all of us, not just the Lummies, is whether or not the Salish Sea is going to be a dead ocean or remain one of those biodiverse estuaries in North America. We're at decision time.
So this relates to one of the potential solutions for at least the captivity-related animal welfare crisis that we deal with. So I'm going to go over it very briefly. This is an entire other presentation I could give on just the logistics of how this all works, but this hasn't been done for orcas. However, there are a number of sanctuaries that exist for other large megafauna, elephant sanctuaries, there are big cat, bear sanctuaries. There's absolutely no reason to believe it cannot be done. The permitting issues are a different story, but we need to start putting ourselves in the animal's position. Science, really, it has spoken. We have decades and decades of trying to provide better for these animals, learning from them, advances in veterinary care, advances in husbandry, and killer whales, orcas in captivity, are still dying prematurely. The facts are just the facts. They're still dying prematurely of illnesses that were preventable and are typically associated with captive conditions. And we know this now, so we have to do better. How can we do better? Just really focusing on the animal agenda. How do you provide for an animal, this kind of an animal, far-ranging, top predator, amazing brain, real cognitive and social and emotional needs? So space is one thing. You need space. A natural environment. How can you encourage that animal to engage in natural behaviors, natural postural adjustments? Part of it is just by providing the space. Every animal will be different, so all of these animals would ideally be provided with individualized care, ongoing lifetime veterinary care as needed. A lot of these animals are coming out of situations where they already have and always will have scars from that situation, both physical and emotional, and dealing with those will be on a case-by-case basis. So even more rigorous in terms of personnel to whale ratio and demands and funding. Obviously, this hasn't been done, so we're exploring all of this now. No breeding, of course, because we already have enough whales in captivity. So looping that back, I've had the privilege of working as an advisor to a number of these initiatives that are really taking off all over the world right now for a number of cetacean species. One of them is right here in North America. It's the Whale Sanctuary Project. And this is just a rendering. The site has not been selected. We're still in site selection process right now. But I love this because to me, it just demonstrates the educational potential of a setting like this. And this loops it all back for me. This is not just about providing Lolita with a better life. It is absolutely about that. It's not just about individual whales, though. It's really about a compassion revolution. It's about moving society forward, teaching children to appreciate animals on an individual level for who they are, respecting them and their environment. And it is only a world in which children are taught to respect and treat all animals, all life with respect, that all life can thrive, including our own. And we have to we're in a critical time right now. So we have no choice. And a few other actions, I'm not gonna go over all of this, but there's a lot of legislative and regulatory avenues that we have already explored and will be continuing to explore, and we've talked about some of them here. There is a federal law that's just been introduced and nothing has happened. It hasn't moved forward yet, but it is bipartisan. We've just had a Republican congressman sign on to the law. It's the Orca Act, and it would essentially impose federal breeding and import bans, import and export for that matter, on specifically orca in captivity. So that would essentially just solidify an end of the era of keeping orcas in tanks. And of course, vehemently opposing future applications for MMPA permits because it is not illegal right now, and yes, it is still going on even as recent as a couple of years ago when a bunch of belugas were slated to be imported, and then that, fortunately, Don was intimately involved in that case, and fortunately that was denied. Enforcing strengthening Animal Welfare Act and enforcing Animal Welfare Act adequately, the way that it needs to be enforced to actually be meaningful for these animals and protect them. ESA, MMPA, obviously we have a unique situation in the federal government right now where we really have to work on safeguarding the foundation that we have to protect these animals, both in the wild and in captivity. Scientifically, obviously seaside sanctuaries are a huge component of providing for better welfare for individual animals. Supporting free-ranging orca research and conservation initiatives because, of course, protecting habitat is how we conserve the wild, right? And it's how we conserve not only places, but species. And vote with your wallet. Don't patronize facilities that where animals are kept in substandard conditions. That's very simple. And support these, we're living in such an exciting time. We have this amazing technology. We have incredible filmmaking going on. I don't know if any of you have seen Planet Earth 2, but like, wow. I mean, the potential to really get intimate, up close and personal with these animals and in a way that completely respects them, that ideally doesn't impact their behavior. and doesn't harm and doesn't harass them. Responsible ecotourism and, new immersive technologies. You have, 3D, I mean, it's just incredible. You can literally bring people into ecosystems now and they don't have to leave their couch. And all of these technologies have the potential to reconnect children with just the awe of nature, inspire them to really protect it. Children don't have to touch a killer whale to love them. They love them already. It's inherent, it's natural to children. So that's the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really incredible. So I think that's a great segue into introducing Steve, in particular because Heather was talking about voting with your wallet, and when Anna and I were talking about this, putting this together this fall, something that was really important to me was that there be the potential that a representative from an aquarium be here to talk about the perspective of working at an aquarium and the roles that aquariums play. Having worked at Monterey Bay Aquarium, there is a spectrum that's important to recognize in terms of the philosophies of aquariums, in terms of their strategies for carrying out their conservation efforts, and whether they will or will not have cetaceans that they house, whether they will have marine mammals at all, how to go about educating. And so we're actually, within the aquarium world, seeing a movement towards the type of work that Steve is doing, which is he's at Shed Aquarium in Chicago, but he does a lot of research in the Caribbean and in the Bahamas, and global shark conservation research. So that may not seem to make a lot of sense, given that Shed Aquarium in Chicago is not directly touching habitat that would be for shark. One other note on that before we'll get started with his presentation is that for this type of work, there are a lot of aquariums, like we've been talking about, that have existing programs, that have kind of this history: Seattle Aquarium, New England Aquarium, Shed. Monterey Bay Aquarium is fortunate in that it was developed a little bit later and wasn't kind of part of this movement where the idea was that you would capture wild animals and then use them for entertainment. But we do have quite a few aquariums that have existing populations in captivity, and they don't want to anymore, and so they're trying to figure out how to do that. So the sanctuary idea that Heather brought up is really groundbreaking and innovative, and a potential solution. And I know if anybody's interested in that, Dawn's done some work with aquariums on kind of how to help aquariums transition populations that they have that are captive. So in addition to Steve's work in the Caribbean and the Bahamas, he is a shark expert and a bit of a celebrity. He has been on the Today Show, How to Survive a Shark Attack. So it's good we have someone that can tell us how to do that. Mythbusters, Do Sharks Like Human Blood? And Dirty Jobs, Testing Chemical Shark Repellents. So we're really excited to have you here. Thank you so much. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm fortunately not going to be talking about Mythbusters or Dirty Jobs during this talk. I'd just like to thank the Animal Law Society for inviting me here. It's a really great honor, and it gives me an opportunity to talk about my favorite subject, sharks, which I need to queue up here. Give me 1 second. Okay, how are we advancing? This? All right, so just in terms of my talk, I'm going to give a little bit of my background as a research biologist and ecologist. I'm not a lawyer and I don't have too much experience with law. So what I'm going to be given really is a overview of conservation of sharks and problems and issues sharks face through the lens of a research biologist. I'll give some basic facts about sharks and how that can make them very susceptible to targeted fisheries and unsustainable as fishing targets. And we'll then talk specifically about that susceptibility to exploitation. I'll then talk about the global assessment of shark catches, what kind of numbers are we talking about, and how that is related to population declines across the globe. We'll talk then about global, more international, I should have said rather than global, and US shark relevant policy. We'll try and end towards the back end on a more positive note, talking about some success stories of management and conservation and policy that have actually resulted in shark population recoveries. And if we have time, I'll try and give a case study of one of my shark research projects that's actually directly influenced policy, but it might be being a bit ambitious there. So in terms of my background, my first experience in shark research was back in 2002 at the Bimini Biological Field Station, where I actually met Dave Jennings, sitting right here. And at that time, I was an undergraduate at Cardiff University, and I was doing a study on prey items of nursery-bound juvenile lemon sharks and how specific prey items interacted with certain habitat types. I then returned to the Bimini Biological Field Station to conduct my PhD research in 2005, looking at the behavior and population dynamics of lemon sharks. During that time, I undertook a side project with the Orca Society, looking at shark conservation and management issues off of the Red Sea coast of Sudan. A lot of people don't even know, and I didn't actually when I was asked to do this project, that Sudan has a coast. I assure you it does. It's quite small, but it's also very pristine, incredibly pristine, the most pristine marine environments I've ever experienced. So there's a lot of healthy shark populations there. Following the completion of my PhD, I went to Florida across the Gulf Stream, and I continued a project that I'd also started during my PhD, looking at large coastal shark species and their spatial ecology up and down the east coast of the US. We were focusing primarily on lemon sharks, bull sharks, and great hammerhead sharks. Then I decided that I really had enough of being quite warm in the subtropics, and that feeling my feet is a luxury I didn't really need. So I decided to travel to Canada and work up in the high Arctic, up in the Lancaster Sound area out of Cornwallis Island. Here I was looking at several marine species and their spatial ecology, including the Greenland shark. Got a lot of press lately about being potentially the oldest vertebrate on the planet. And this is very important work as it's creating baseline data for an area that's very much opening up to human activity with the receding ice caps. After a very short spell at Michigan State University where I was studying lake sturgeon, they were the closest thing I could find to sharks in the Great Lakes ecosystem, I took a position at Shedd Aquarium. And as you pointed out before, a lot of people don't associate Chicago with shark research. I get asked that question a lot, why are you in Chicago if you specialize in sharks? What a lot of people don't realize about Shedd, and we definitely need to be promoting more, is that Shedd actually has a really incredible research vessel called the Coral Reef 2, which is based down in Miami. And we keep that on the Miami River, and that affords us the opportunity to go out and do fantastic research out in the Bahamas and Caribbean. And Shedd's been doing work out there in one form or another for well over 20 years, probably over 30 years now. During that time, we've actually fostered a very personable relationship with the Bahamian government and the Bahamas National Trust, who runs the series of marine parks within the Bahamas. And this is a really important thing for us, as it allows us to involve policymakers at the base level when we design our research projects. And that really is the best way that we can get our applied research projects to be uptaken into policy and management and actually really make a difference in terms of conserving marine ecosystems in these regions. Because if you involve the policymakers at the base level, they're going to be a lot more likely to actually listen to your results and actually use that data when they're developing and improving their policies. Here at the Shedd Aquarium, I've been here about 8 months now. I've established a shark and ray research program. It's essentially threefold. I'm not going to get too much into this. It's quite new and still evolving as we speak. But it's basically based initially in assessing abundance and biodiversity across the Bahamas and Caribbean. The ICUN Shark Specialist Group is very interested in doing a regional assessment for shark and ray species around the Bahamas and Caribbean, and they really lack in many areas a lot of basic data about abundance and biodiversity. That's really the bedrock of these kind of assessments. I also I'm doing a project focused on assessing the near and far benefits of the Bahamas Shark Sanctuary. So in the Bahamas in 2011, they designated all the waters, their EEZ, which is an area of around 600 square kilometers, as a shark sanctuary. So it's actually illegal to catch and kill sharks, intentionally catch sharks, and if you do catch them incidentally, you have to let them go alive. If you kill them, that's a violation of the law, and that really protects them over a very large area. Obviously, enforcement can be an issue, and we'll talk about that a bit more as we go on, but I want to continue to demonstrate the benefit of the establishment of the Bahamas as a shark sanctuary to the nation so that they don't go back on this for maybe financial gain in the future, but also look at the benefits to surrounding areas, the Gulf of Mexico, the broader Caribbean, Northwest Atlantic, in terms of spillover effects and healthy shark populations and how that can benefit other areas as well. And then finally, a more kind of scientific question where we're using a marine park within the shark sanctuary, a no-take marine reserve, to look at shark abundances inside and outside of that marine park, where the main governing factor driving shark abundance is likely to be prey availability, and that gets at the idea of carrying capacity and its relationship towards to shark abundance. So let's start with some basic facts about sharks. I promise I'm not trying to patronize anyone, but I just assumed a lower level of knowledge than, you know, some of the other shark fanatic audiences I speak to. Sharks, one of my favorite facts about sharks that I like to open with is they're actually older than dinosaurs. They originated on this planet around 450 million years ago, and they've survived every major extinction event that has been subsequent to that, until now in the Anthropocene, where shark populations are very much at threat. They're actually also older than trees. I like that fact too. So over that 450 million years, they've evolved into a wide variety of species of many different sizes and shapes that inhabit pretty much every ecosystem on our Earth's ocean, and even some freshwater ecosystems as well. Now, one thing I'm going to point out is I'm using the term sharks, and often when we talk about sharks these days, we are talking about all elasmobranch fishes. So sharks, skates, rays, and chimeras, all chondrichthyan fishes. But that's not always the case, and when it pertains to policy and law, it's very much comes down to the wording in those documents that dictate whether these laws are protecting specifically just sharks or all shark species. And with many of the ray species being the most threatened of all the elasmobranchs, that's a very important distinction to make. So why should we care about sharks? There's many people on this planet that hate sharks and think that they should all be destroyed. There's a very high-profile one in your government right now, in fact. But sharks are important to this planet and our ocean ecosystems. I was going to claim they're the top predators, but we just had to talk about orcas, so I don't think I can get away with that. So we'll say they're an upper trophic level predator. They're one of the primary upper trophic level predators in the marine ecosystem. And food webs are very complex. This is a massive oversimplification of a typical marine food web, but removing top predators have top-down effects on that ecosystem and can very much unbalance these ecosystems. So in terms of maintaining healthy ecosystems, it's important for us to maintain shark populations. We can also, and this speaks more to some people than others, we can actually demonstrate a direct economic benefit of healthy live shark populations. I'm going to use again the Bahamas, as I'm very familiar with it, as a case study. Bahamas is often referred to as the shark dive capital of the world. It's estimated that shark dive, specifically shark dive related tourism, is worth around $113 million US to the Bahamian economy. And there's a lot of studies that we've been able to demonstrate, and this was very important in the designation of the Bahamas as a shark sanctuary. So to put that in a different term, it's estimated that each shark alive in the Bahamas through tourism is worth around $15,000 per year. Whereas if you're going to harvest that shark in a fishery, you get a one-time fee at the fish market of around $300. Unfortunately, many of the facts about sharks are the reasons that they are susceptible to overexploitation and targeted fisheries and population declines associated with that. Now, we saw a very similar slide to this in the Orca talk. Now, sharks are fish. They're definitely fish, but many species of shark, not all, but many species of shark have life history qualities that are much more similar to mammals than they are to other fish that tend to spawn and release millions of young, and they kind of hedge their bets in investing a low amount of investment in a lot of individuals with a the idea that a few of them will survive. Sharks don't do that. They invest a lot of time and energy in a small number of larger individuals with the idea that those survival rates will be infinitely higher. So for many case-selected shark species, we have slow growth, late maturity, long gestation periods, low fecundity, and long-lived. We already mentioned the Greenland sharks that, there's some estimates in the range of 400 years, maybe a little high, but they're very old at least. I'll give another example of the spiny dogfish, which it doesn't reach maturity till it's around 20 years of age. It then has a 2-year gestation period, which is actually longer than a blue whale. And at the end of that 2-year gestation period, it can have as few as 2 pups. So their potential to sustain targeted exploitation can be very low. But again, there's over 450 species of sharks right now that have been described. Some species, that's not the case. They mature a lot quicker and they have a lot more young, a lot more regularly. And there are some species that we can potentially sustainably exploit. Why are sharks so highly targeted? The main reason for it is the demand from the Asian market for shark fins, for shark fin soup. There's a lot of people in Asia and there's also a lot of money, so this demand is very high. And shark fin soup is something that is considered very prestigious. It's normally a very grand events such as government events, although in China recently they stopped having shark fin soup at government events, which is a great step forward. But weddings is another example of when when shark fin soup might be served. And because of this, it's really elevated the price of shark fins around the globe. As a result of this very high elevation, it makes the fins very valuable, but relative to the fins, the flesh of the shark is not worth anything, essentially. So in many cases, what happened was the establishment of shark fin fisheries, shark finning. And we'll define shark fin as the removal and retention of shark fins prior to discarding the body back into the ocean at sea. The reason for this is sharks are typically very large, their fins are a lot smaller and lighter and worth a lot more money. So if you've got limited space on, say, a smaller vessel, that's in your benefit, you're going to get a lot more for the amount of weight you can carry on your boat. So let's get into kind of assessment of global shark catches. Sharks are very highly targeted around the globe. And these are actually Thresher Sharks. These are photos I took in Dubai at the fish market. These are all Thresher Sharks. I've never seen a Thresher Shark in the wild, despite many years of being in the ocean. Same with Makos. These are all Mako Sharks. These are all fins drying out in the sun. This is 1 day of catches of salmon shark at a fish market in Japan. Now, these salmon sharks, at least in this scenario, in this case, they're actually utilizing the whole shark. They take the fins, they eat the flesh, they even eat the hearts of these sharks. So at least there's not a huge amount of waste there, but this is also the same fish market the same day. This is 1 day's catch of blue sharks. And here the blue shark flesh is not worth nearly as much as the salmon shark flesh. So you can see there's guys here removing the fins into these baskets, and then they'll take these carcasses and put them on a truck and take them to a landfill site. So there's a lot of waste associated with this industry. But how many sharks are being caught? We really need to get a handle on what kind of numbers we're talking about and how that might relate to population decline. So the first person to attempt to do this was this fantastic scientist here, Shelley Clark. And for her PhD thesis, she went to Hong Kong and spent 2 or 3 years in Hong Kong at the fish markets. And her goal was to try and get a handle on what kind of number of sharks would be required to supply the global fin trade. Now, Hong Kong isn't the only fish market that sells or trades shark fins, but it's probably the largest, so it was a good indicator, and she was able to extrapolate out from there and get a pretty good handle on what kind of numbers we might be talking about. And after the conclusion and publishing of her PhD thesis, she concluded that her best estimates was somewhere between 26 and 73 million sharks per year that were required to sustain the level of trade that was being shipped through Hong Kong and the other fin markets around the globe. Now, this was great. It was the first time we really had a handle, and it was quite worrying and troubling because, as I say, sharks are upper predator. There's not probably going to be a lot of, them in the oceans relative to other fish. But what actually happened with this study is that people, conservation groups, lobbyists, they kind of latched on to that 73 million figure because it sounded better, it sounded more impressive and more dramatic, so that got thrown around a lot. But people got wise to this. Fishermen are typically, fishing industry personnel are not that stupid. They're not stupid people. And they go to the literature and they look at the studies, and they were able to discredit a lot of this policy or the pushes for this policy by pointing out the misuse of this higher number. So one of my appointments was I actually sit on the Shark Advisory Board for the Pew Charitable Trust Global Shark Conservation Group. And the Pew Charitable Trust, they put a lot of effort and a lot of money into lobbying for things like trade bans, CITES. They do a lot of work with CITES and also policy in country and international and national policy. And they wanted some more robust estimates that they could use in their efforts to try and increase shark conservation potential around the globe. And they tasked us, the Scientific Advisory Board, with coming up with some more robust estimates that not only included sharks that would be captured and killed for the fin trade, but other sharks that would be not introduced into the fin trade, so consumed locally, or even discarded as sea as bycatch, and that level of mortality as well. The way we went at this, and this is best summed up in this one kind of figure here, is we needed a starting point to try and make these estimates. And the only real reliable data that was out there that we kind of could put any worth in was the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization's landing records. So when sharks are caught in regulated fisheries, all that data goes to the FAO and they have those landing records. But essentially, there's nothing else. So everything else, in terms of trying to get other numbers for shark catches, we had to go to the literature and come up with our best estimates. And in doing this, we had to be quite conservative if we were going to have any credibility at the end of this and not get completely destroyed by the reviewers. So we worked backwards from the FAO, and we looked at landed, and we estimated around 500,000 tons, metric tons are landed per year in shark fisheries. So the remainder of that is illegal, unregulated and unreported catches, and we estimate that to be just over 100,000 tons. There's then a large proportion of sharks that are discarded at sea, and the reason that this is a lot larger than those that land is because this includes the fin fisheries. These are considered discarded animals. We estimated that the fin fishery is responsible for around 908,000 metric tons per year. The rest are caught as bycatch and hopefully released alive. Again, we're being quite conservative here. We estimated that to be around 227,000 metric tons. But of those released alive, there's going to be an associated mortality due to capture-related stress. And from the literature, there's a lot of studies in catch and release mortality of elasmobranchs, and we estimated that around maybe 34,000 tons would die post-release. So that left us with a total estimated mortality for the year 2000, I'll point out, of 1.44 million metric tons. We then reran these estimates for the year 2010 to give ourselves a bit of a range, and we came up with an estimate that was slightly lower, around 1.41 million metric tons. But when you speak to people, when you're trying to lobby and you're speaking to people in the public, they're not really interested in weight. They don't know what that means. You really need to give them numbers. So we were then trying to figure out, well, what does that mean? How many sharks does that translate to? So what we did, we again went to the literature and we looked at the composition of reported landings and catches, both those that are reported and are not reported. And this is how sharks are broken down in policy, at least in the US, into 4 main groups: large coastal sharks, pelagic sharks, small coastal sharks, and deep water sharks. And these sharks all have different sizes. So using different scenarios, we were able to predict how many sharks this weight translated to. And our absolute best and most robust estimates came out to be around 100 million individual sharks for the year 2000, and slightly less at 97 million individual sharks in the year 2010. Using an absolute minimum, so if we only consider the sharks caught or reported in the FAO landings and the average weight from these complexes, it's an absolute minimum of 49 million sharks per year, but that's obviously completely unrealistic. It doesn't account for any fin sharks, any illegal fisheries. And using different scenarios, we came up with estimates that ranged between 63 and 273 million individuals per year. But to be consistent, we put our most worth in these estimates here, roughly around 100 million sharks per year. And it seemed to be pretty consistent. So what does that mean? Are we just scratching the surface there? Is that a lot of sharks relative to what's in the ocean? Are there billions of sharks? Does it not make a difference? Well, we wanted to try and get at this as well, and there was actually the study that came out by Simon Jennings et al. At Simon Fraser University, where they estimated virgin biomass of elasmobranchs, among other things. So the virgin biomass pre-mechanized fishing, and they came out with an estimate of 86.4 million metric tons. We assumed that half of these were sharks. Here we were specifically looking at sharks. We're going to make that definition again. We're not talking about skates and rays here as well, other elasmobranchs, just sharks. So we assumed conservatively that probably half of those were sharks. They thought 43.2 million metric tons. And we assumed, again, very conservatively, that half of those sharks remain post-mechanized fishing. So this is 21.6 million metric tons. This gives us an exploitation rate ranging from 6.4 to 7.9% of all sharks taken each year. So to put that more simply, 1 in every 15 sharks roughly is taken each year. However, that doesn't mean in 15 years that all sharks are going to be gone, because shark populations are dynamic. Sharks are born every year as well as they're taken. So we used reproductive potential that have been calculated in the literature for 26 species of shark, and then we recalculated that potential for another 36 species with biological data available to fulfill those calculations, and we came up with a mean reproductive potential of shark species of around 4.9%. So 6.4 to 7.9% is in excess, so we're taking more than they're able to replenish through reproduction. So in that scenario, you have declining populations. It's about 35% higher than what is sustainable. And this has resulted in documented shark population declines for many species across the globe. These values are a little controversial in the field, but either way, we're seeing declines in many different regions. Another study by Dolby et al., also from Simon Fraser University, estimated that one quarter of all elasmobranch species, so shark, skates, and rays, are at risk from extinction currently under projected population trends. That doesn't mean that sharks cannot be fished sustainably. Some species, it's out of the question. Life history is just not conducive to sustainable exploitation, but there are other species where this can be possible. And this recent paper, it's more of a note, came out by Simpfendorfer and Dolby in Current Biology, and it's actually identified existing well-managed sustainable shark fisheries. So anything in green here is a well-managed sustainable shark fishery, some down here in Australasia here. And these yellow dots, these populations, are populations of sharks that are not currently being sustainably fished, but with the correct management could be. So there is some potential for exploitation of sharks. And given concerns over global food security, this could be a very important resource for the human population. So we shouldn't rule out the potential. I know some scientists who have been really pushing for a global moratorium on shark fishing, similar to what we saw for the great whales. Now that's appropriate for some species, but for all species, that's just not appropriate scientifically. But if you do notice, the proportion of potential sustainable shark fisheries is very small relative to the global fishing effort. So what do we do about this? We have declining shark populations. How do we make happy shark populations? I'm going to give a very quick summary of internationally shark relevant policy. First being the FAO in response to concern over declining shark populations. In 1999, the FAO introduced an international plan of action for the conservation and management of sharks, and this pushed fishing nations to develop national and regional plans of actions for sharks and rays, looking for sustainable catches, increased data collection, special protection for endangered species, and also the conservation of biodiversity of shark and ray species. The US was actually the first to come up with a plan of action for sharks, I think in 2001. There's other organizations that are not shark focused, but have shark relevant policy. One is the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna. The reason they have shark relevant policy is many of their fishing techniques, particularly longline, it has a very high occurrence of shark bycatch. So they actually were the first regional fisheries management organization to ban shark finning, demanding a 5% fin to body ratio when ships came into port. They also encourage member nations to report catch effort data, release sharks alive where possible, try and make gear more selective towards tuna and reduce shark bycatch, and also aid in the identification of shark nursery areas, particularly in the pelagic environment. They also have species-specific recommendations for some endangered species, such as makos, porbeagles, big-eye thresher, and oceanic whitetips. We also have the North Atlantic Fishery Organization and Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission that have similar wording in their members' agreements. We have trade restrictions with CITES and also the Convention for the Conservation of Migratory Species. Sharks, many species are highly migratory, and they will cross management boundaries and inhabit international waters. So this can make them very difficult to manage, and that's what CMS really tries to get at. They have with their member signatories, they have agreements in trying to have international cooperation in shark conservation. Just to give a quick history of sharks and CITES, that's going to be a little bit small. But Appendix 2, which restricts trade, and you need permits to actually trade these species. In 2003, we had basking sharks and whale sharks added to Appendix 2. This was followed in 2005 by great white sharks. The only species of elasmobranch, it's actually a ray, sawfish, there's 7 species. The only group species of elasmobranch is the sawfish that are enlisted onto Appendix 1, which is highly restricted trade for those species. Then that was in 2007. In 2014, we had a bit of a bumpy year with porbeagle sharks, oceanic whitetips, 3 species of hammerhead and manta rays going on to Appendix 2. And then in 2017, devil rays, thresher sharks, and silky sharks were also added. Many of the same species on the appendixes for CMS with the addition of mako and spiny dogfish. In terms of the US, the first regulations were very shark specific, and I may be incorrect in this. So you might have a better idea, but some of the most relevant shark policy relates to finning. In 1999, there was an Atlantic ban on shark finning. They followed the same thing as the ICAT, where you had a 5% wet fin to dress carcass weight ratio when you came into port. In 2000, the Shark Finning Prohibition Act outlawed finning in the Pacific, so then we had shark finning ban in the Atlantic and the Pacific. In 2008, National Marine Fisheries Service amended the Atlantic finning regulations to be fins attached. So it used to be that you just had to have weight, your weight of shark fins on your boat could only be 5% of the weight of your total shark products on your boat, of your bodies of sharks. This actually required fishermen to keep the fins attached until they got back to port. And this reduced the amount of illegal activity that could go on because it increased the ability for enforcement. If there are prohibited species, it was a lot easier to identify them when they came back into port. When you remove the fins from a lot of shark species, it's very difficult to tell what kind of sharks they came from. Then in 2011, the U.S. Shark Conservation Act mandated that U.S. Pacific fishers also ended shark fin removal at sea. So the only fins that can be removed from the dusky is from the dusky smoothhounds, and that's a very sustainable fishery in the Atlantic. In 1993, we had those separate quotas come in for the different complexes of sharks, the large coastals, the pelagics, the deep water sharks, and the small coastal sharks. In 1997, a series of sharks were added to a prohibited species list, so removed from those quotas, and that was originally 19 species. We also have other options like time area closures that can protect specific habitat for certain times of year, maybe when sharks are breeding or in their nursery phase. An example of this is January through July for North Carolina to protect dusky sharks. And in 2003 and 2011, respectively, 2 species of swordfish, the small tooth and large tooth, were afforded the highest level of federal protection through listing under the Endangered Species Act. So currently, the main policy relating to shark that's actually on the floor at the moment is this Shark Fin Trade Elimination Act, which was proposed in 2017. And this would make it illegal, I don't know if you can read that, but illegal to process, buy, sell, or transport shark fins or any product containing shark fins. This might sound like a very positive move from the US government to try and protect sharks. However, definitely from the scientific community, this bill is getting a lot of pushback. And the reason is, the theory behind this is it really undermines those sustainable shark fisheries and the potential for the development of future sustainable shark fisheries. This kind of legislation is probably more appropriate in developing countries where you don't have the at-sea resources for enforcement. You don't have a very structured fisheries management plans like you do in the US. You're actually very advanced globally compared to a lot of other nations, including the UK. So there's a lot of pushback from this, and I personally don't think this one's gonna pass. Other things we can do to try and protect sharks, we can have marine protected areas and reserves, also shark sanctuaries, which I touched on with the Bahamas. I know you're going to talk about MPAs, so I'm going to brush over this a little bit. One of the tricky things with MPAs for sharks is they are very wide roaming typically, so you'd have to protect very large areas in order to actually protect their range and protect them for the entire year. Also, enforcement in many countries is a problem. The resources for enforcement is very limited, so you have what you call paper parks, where they're just parks in theory, but there's no enforcement, so a lot of illegal poaching occurs. Sanctuaries were an idea of Pew and the environmental group, and they basically, as I said, restrict specifically to sharks the capture and harvest of shark species. There's many around the world, including the Bahamas. A lot of criticism of shark sanctuaries have been that unless you actually restrict gears, where you have high shark bycatch like long lines and gill nets, it's kind of, you're still going to get a lot of shark mortality associated with those fishing gears. Also, again, enforcement is another problem with those shark sanctuaries. I'll kind of brush over this because I kind of got carried away talking about that. So very quickly, how am I doing? I've got like 2 minutes, a minute. I'll try and give an example of how science can inform management and policy. We have a great need for accurate and current data when we're trying to develop policy for any wildlife. And the sharks are no different to this. So this is where the research biologists and ecologists can come in and hopefully work with the policymakers to inform them and give them the most up-to-date information. And one fantastic example of this is actually the Global Finprint Program, which is funded by, it was actually an $8 million grant funded by Vulcan, which is Paul G. Allen's conservation fund. And they are still in the process of assessing, it's actually the largest global shark biodiversity and abundance assessment to date. And they're doing a fantastic job with this. And recently they just published a paper, and this is from a reef off northeast Australia, where they showed active enforcement. A park that was in existence but not enforced had very poor shark populations. And then following the introduction of regular enforcement, the shark populations actually recovered very rapidly to where they actually now have a lot of sharks in that area. Another success story in the US is policy relating to the sandbar shark. The sandbar shark was very disproportionately targeted in the US shark fishery. One of the reasons is it has very big dorsal fins and pectoral fins, so its fin to body ratio is very favorable for those shark fishermen. But in 2008, the National Marine Fisheries Service actually banned all commercial landings of sandbar sharks, and this was based on a 2006 stock assessment, extensive stock assessment. So as you can see, it can take a little bit of time for this data to trickle up from the researchers into policy. But recent stock assessments in 2006 actually indicate that this sandbar shark population in the Northeast Atlantic has recovered incredibly well, in fact, beyond what would be expected from recovery predictions. So policy, if done right, can work very effectively. And I'm going to skip over this because I've talked too long, I've rambled on too much about this stuff. But just on those last 2 points, there is still hope. There's a lot of doom and gloom surrounding shark conservation and shark populations, and there is a lot of cause for concern. But there is hope. Reducing demand in Asia is a big challenge, and if we can do that, I think if we can reduce the value of shark fins, people will stop targeting sharks. Sharks are a pain in the ass. They're big, they're snappy, they ruin your gear, they get tangled up, they're hard to deal with. So the only reason people are really targeting sharks is because they get a lot of money for it. And if we can kind of turn that around, that will give them a lot of hope. But if we can also implement proper management based in science, then we really do have hope that many of these shark populations can recover. I'm really going to have to just go rapid through this. This was just an example, a very brief overview. We were able to demonstrate that shark aggregations, seasonal shark aggregations in Florida represent a very high concentration of the actual entire US East Coast population that were also genetically distinct from those in the Gulf. And as a result, we were able to, working with Florida Fish and Wildlife, get prohibition for lemon sharks in Florida state waters. This data is also influencing essential fish habitat designations for National Marine Fisheries Service and a proposed habitat area of particular concern. And we also contributed data for essential fish habitat redesignations for tiger sharks, great hammerheads, bull sharks, nurse sharks, and Caribbean reef sharks. So in summary, is major concern over many species globally. Some species can, however, be fished sustainably, so we need to recognize the variability in shark populations, shark and ray populations, and see that it is possible for sustainable fisheries to occur. And we should work to make policy that allows that to happen. Recovery is possible. It's not too late for many species, but we do need more effective measures, and these need to be based in sound scientific fact. Thank you.
So I think one of the things that strikes me about hearing about your presentation is just how fortunate we are at this point in 2018 to be able to be working at the intersection of law, science, and policy. 30, 40 years ago, that wasn't necessarily the case. You were siloed in your own discipline, and it's actually really exciting to have scientists that want to engage with policymakers and lawyers that want to hear about the science. So I think that's really awesome. And it's a great way to introduce Professor Aaron Strong, who comes to us from the University of Maine. He has undergraduate degrees in political science and biology, right, from Swarthmore. And then he has a master's in climate change policy from Tufts. And we met out at Stanford when he was doing the EIPER program, which I can't tell you what that stands for, but suffice it to say, what I thought was really interesting about his PhD program is that his faculty advisors included lawyers and hardcore scientists, and so all of his research had to be vetted by very different disciplines, and provides him with a unique perspective on how to approach ocean conservation issues. So we'll get started with your talk.
So thanks so much, Sarah, for the introduction, and thanks to the Animal Law Society for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to speak with all of you this evening, and my goal is to tell a story about what's currently going on in international ocean governance and how some of what's going on relates to issues of marine wildlife conservation. So this is sort of hot topic. There are treaties being negotiated right now, and there are opportunities within those treaties to think about how do we want to advance some key issues for marine conservation of wildlife species. And in particular, cetaceans and shark species figure prominently in this. So in some ways, following on these previous two presentations is really great. These are the major issues in the policy related to wildlife conservation in the marine realm right now in terms of how we deal with animal welfare issues that Heather and Don spoke about for cetaceans in captivity, and how we deal with shark conservation issues globally. So I'm going to take a much more kind of panoptic perspective on the current goings-on in international ocean governance. I'm not a wildlife law expert or an animal law expert. I focus mostly on international ocean law and policy and international climate law and policy. So just a brief outline of the talk. I know it's late, so we might speed through the last part of this, but I really want to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals and the first ever UN Ocean Conference, which took place in 2017 last year. And then I want to talk about the negotiation of a new treaty, a new internationally legally binding instrument under the law of the sea for the creation of marine protected areas and actually other provisions regulating marine genetic resources on the high seas. I want to also talk a little bit about the largest high seas MPA that has been designated to date, which is actually under a separate convention in Antarctica. This is the Ross Sea MPA, which was finally approved after years of contentious negotiations in October of 2016, so relatively recently. And finally, if we have time, all of the thinking about the social lives of cetaceans has made me think a lot about how we do something called the climate vulnerability assessment, and whether we need to think about non-human animals and their agency within this paradigm that's emerged kind of in climate law. So that's a fun thing to talk about. It's something I think about in terms of the animal law space if we have time to get there. So my goal is that you leave this talk with an appreciation that right now is an incredibly exciting time for international ocean governance, and that we're setting some new institutional norms that really might create path dependencies for our future. You know, we negotiated the convention that underlies the International Whaling Commission quite a long time ago. And how it was put together and structured dictates now how the IWC works. Well, we're creating a new legal instrument right now, and there may be a lot of effects of the decisions that we make about the principles that are involved within that new legal instrument that could have far-reaching effects for marine wildlife conservation into the future. So I want you to pause all for a moment and think about the high seas. Think about the open ocean, the pelagic ocean. What do you see? Do you put yourself underwater? Do you put yourself on top of the water? Do you see organisms moving through it? How many people have ever been in a place where they couldn't see land? Great, that's awesome. It's great to see so many of you. Well, right now, if we take a look at where the conversation around international ocean governance is, has a lot to do with these things. The blue economy, resilience, plastic pollution, ocean acidification, and climate change. These are the memes that we see in international ocean governance discussions. They grow out of rising scientific concern about all of these issues. I mean, we've seen press releases recently on ocean plastics almost weekly now that are really scary and really humbling. They're big new pushes to figure out how we can use marine resources sustainably and how we can put ocean technology in the oceans, maybe to enhance sustainability, maybe to continue to exploit the oceans. What is the blue economy and what is it going to look like? But the question I want to sort of prime us all with is, within these ongoing conversations where we're talking about ocean acidification, climate change, resilience, blue economy, plastics, where are marine wildlife in these conversations? How do we think about them and how do we incorporate consideration of conservation of marine wildlife into our current discussions of international ocean governance? What does this mean for species? This is Squitina, endangered angel shark species. What do all of these conversations that are taking place right now and have been taking place over the last 10, 15 years as we've moved into a new world of discussing things in terms of systems and ecosystem-based management, what does that mean for our approaches to conserving marine wildlife? So I want to start this story with talking about the Millennium Development Goals. Agreed in 2000, they set 2015 as a target for significant reductions in a whole lot of different things. There were 8 of them, and under the Ensure Environmental Sustainability, goal number 7, there was a push for significant reductions in species, including marine species threatened with extinctions. Now, there were lack of clear origins of the goals, tremendous amount of lack of coordination and implementation. There was an attempt to accelerate I sort of say throw money at the problem in 2010, but ultimately I think we can conclude that the Millennium Development Goals didn't live up to their potential. They were agreed in 2000 with a 2015 target, and we really didn't achieve them. And in 2015, we set a new set of targets, this time 17 instead of 8, for a 2030 agenda, keeping the 15-year time frame, and these are the Sustainable Development Goals. And the marine environment for the first time was specifically recognized as a separate goal. Sustainable Development Goal 14, Life Underwater. And this is a broader pattern in international environmental governance of a recognition of the ocean as a unique domain that merits its own consideration, rather than simply the ocean being part of the Convention on Biological Diversity, or part of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or part of CITES in terms of marine species, that the ocean itself merits a special consideration. And that led to the development of the first ever UN Ocean Conference 2 years later, which we'll talk about in a second. Sustainable Development Goal 14, I know that you can't read this, I'm not expecting you to, has a series of sub-goals and sub-targets that have to do with marine pollution, that have to do with the sustainable management of ecosystems and ocean acidification. There's an explicit 2020 target for the total amount of ocean area that should be put under conservation. That's 10% by 2020 of coastal and marine areas. There's a call to prohibit certain forms of fisheries subsidies, which are really important when we think about some of the overfishing and overexploitation of fisheries. And then there are particular goals about the transfer of scientific knowledge, about providing economic benefits to small island and developing states and least developed countries, and to support small-scale artisanal fisheries. There's not a tremendous recognition here of marine wildlife. There's calls for ocean acidification, marine plastic pollution, all those things I talked about before, but really it comes in the implementation of some of these conservation and ecosystem management measures that we see. That is where we're going to see marine wildlife potentially be part of the implementation of Sustainable Development Goal 14. But on its surface, I think it's, it's something I support. I support Sustainable Development Goal 14. It's something I think we should all get behind, but it very much has a systems approach that doesn't necessarily call out the need for protections for particular species that are endangered or threatened. So what? That's another lofty UN goal. Great. Like, we had them before, they haven't always worked. Is this going to be different? And what's going on with it? So in 2015, Sweden and Fiji got together and said, in 2017, let's bring all the countries of the world together, as many as we can get, and have a conference where we actually talk about how we want to implement that ocean-specific goal, just Sustainable Development Goal 14. And that led to the first ever UN Ocean Conference, which took place last year. Was anyone in the room there? That was great. It took place over a week, right around World Ocean Day in early June, and there was a call for action to implement Sustainable Development Goal 14 through a new kind of mechanism. This is a big shift that we've seen both with the Paris Agreement and now in the ocean, with the Ocean Conference, away from top-down sort of structurally negotiated decisions about what particular requirements are going to be on countries towards a more bottom-up approach. In this case, a call for voluntary commitments, kind of similar to the NDCs that we saw in the Paris Agreement, but not just from countries, from any entity. So initiatives voluntarily undertaken individually or in partnership to contribute to the implementation of Sustainable Development Goal 14, and they could come from governments, from IGOs, from non-governmental organizations, other kinds of civil society organizations, individuals, and notably the private sector, scientific community, and philanthropic organizations. And these voluntary commitments are the structure for implementing Sustainable Development Goal 14. So the idea is that we will achieve all of those particular goals from MPAs, for the adequate and sustainable conservation and management of our marine and coastal ecosystems through these commitments. So what do they look like? This is the webpage. You can all go there. There's 1,422 of them. And you can search them and understand what the world has committed to. This is a community-based sea turtle conservation initiative in Sri Lanka, for example. This is the length of the entire commitment. It also tells us the sustainable development goals that are covered. So you can see which ones of those individual goals are covered, and a series of deliverables and a time frame for those deliverables. So where do we see marine wildlife within these 1,422 commitments? Well, first of all, most of them are still from governments and from NGOs. There's far less from the private sector, but there's still a fair amount of engagement in terms of what these voluntary commitments for actions are. So let's think about where animals fall. So what I did, together with one of my graduate students, is we went through all of the voluntary commitments, and we looked at which ones spoke about climate change, about biodiversity generally, about marine protected areas, and then we had one which is this voluntary commitment particularly focused on identifiable marine wildlife species. Now, it may not just be one species, and of course MPAs are incredibly beneficial, as we've heard, but there's a difference between a marine protected area as a voluntary commitment and a shark sanctuary or a shark and rays sanctuary as a voluntary commitment, where there's an identifiable target of the conservation initiative. And you can see that there's far less engagement with animal-specific or single-species or multi-species specific targeted voluntary commitments for conservation purposes. And interestingly, if we then start looking at the most frequent sort of targets of the conservation focus, cetacean species feature prominently, as do sharks, whales, and dolphins. We've actually separated here. But keep in mind, there's 1,422 of these, right? And so these are ones where whales, and it might be whales and dolphins and turtles, are brought together. I actually left turtles off of this, but they're right about here. So I think one of the conclusions that we can come to from looking at this kind of analysis is that there's some engagement with particular wildlife species, but nowhere near as much as engagement as there is with biodiversity in general, with marine protected areas in general, with climate-based initiatives in general, that it's a relatively small fraction of the global effort to implement Sustainable Development Goal 14. And there's only one private sector voluntary commitment, only one that is focused on a single species, or this conservation target, and it's dolphins. And it's interesting in light of the conversation we had before. Hotel Plan Suisse is strengthening its cooperation with the Swiss NGO Ocean Care with a particular focus on dolphin protection. The aim is to advise customers against visiting dolphinaria and swimming with dolphins by educating and raising awareness of the issue. Such activities will no longer be advertised. There could have been a lot more of these. And there still can be, because the voluntary commitments are still open. It's not a closed process. Now, many of these things are initiatives that are already being undertaken. But this is a way of signaling that part of our vision for sustainable development, for implementing these goals on an international stage, is ending the captivity of cetaceans. That's part of what sustainable development of the oceans is. And we see one example from the private sector here. There's some more from NGOs that speak to this issue, but we could see certainly a lot more of this. So if you're interested in sustainable development goals as a sort of means of implementing animal welfare policy, I think there's a lot of cross-fertilization that can happen there. So what kinds of actions are within those species-focused conservation actions? A lot of new whale and shark sanctuaries were announced, which is really exciting. And not whale sanctuaries in the sense that Heather was talking about before, but large areas, marine protected areas focused on whale conservation, often with a major scientific component for new monitoring of understudied species of cetaceans. Community-based turtle conservation initiatives, a lot of monitoring and data collection on specific species, several plans for ship site reduction and noise pollution reduction and noise pollution investigations. New Zealand had a major seabird conservation action plan that was initiated. There's an interesting set of citizen science projects, including something called Gotham Whale. I don't know if anyone's heard about that, but I'm looking into it more, which is based in New York City. And then relation to some of the shark issues that Stephen was talking about before, a lot of pledges to implement particularly new initiatives under CITES, to propose new initiatives under CITES, and to advance some of those were laid out at the UN Ocean Conference. Now, I study climate change and international ocean governance. This is an issue, if you haven't heard about, it's interesting to think about, that whales actually play a role in affecting our global climate by serving as a way to export surface carbon that's exchanged with the atmosphere to the deep ocean where it's effectively sequestered. We're still trying to get a handle on how much is here, but I spent a week at the UN Ocean Conference and I heard multiple ministers from multiple countries talk about how their whale sanctuaries were part of their climate plan. And it's real. Now, we have to be careful because if we start giving credits all over the place, we actually might enable other sources of emissions to continue. So I'm not advocating the use of whale offsets, although there are people who talk very, very significantly about whale offsets, and investing in whale offsets is a way to go carbon neutral. That is a real conversation happening right now internationally. So I urge caution about that, but no caution about the recognition of the role of healthy populations of cetaceans in influencing the global climate. So implementation will be tested in 2020. 3 years after the first UN Ocean Conference, we'll have the second UN Ocean Conference, and Portugal has volunteered to host. So if you're thinking about getting involved in international conservation issues in marine spaces, pay attention to what's coming through for 2020. Okay, so that's the UN Ocean Conference and Sustainable Development Goals. Next, I want to talk about a new treaty. Now, this is all voluntary that I've talked about before, but now we're going to talk about an internationally legally binding instrument under the law of the sea. This is the new international legally binding instrument under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction, otherwise known as this, or just BBNJ. Yes, it's the UN. There's a hole in our international multilateral environmental agreements. We don't have a treaty that focuses in particular on biodiversity on the high seas or on the ability to have spatially based management or other conservation initiatives in areas beyond national jurisdiction. We have this for particular species or species sets. We have the regional fisheries management organizations, we have the International Whaling Commission, and we have an international seabed authority that controls the bottom of the high seas and what you can extract from it, but we do not have a binding agreement that particularly focuses on the water column all the way from the surface to the ocean in areas beyond national jurisdiction down to that seabed. And this is what we need. There's a major gap. And why do we need it now? We need it now because it's being exploited more and more, because more countries are involved in the exploitation of resources, including from bioprospecting, including fisheries, and including new initiatives, marine technology initiatives that are taking place in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So the history behind the negotiation of this new agreement really started in almost 7 years ago, about 7 years ago, where elements of a package deal that would address this gap were first negotiated. Then in June of 2014, there were plans for a proposal to have a preparatory committee that eventually led to a UN resolution the following year from the General Assembly to move forward. There were holdouts for a while, which were US and Canada and Russia and Japan and Iceland, and we'll talk about that for a second. From 2016 in April to 2017 of last year, there were 4 preparatory committee meetings. Now, the goal here is that we figured out what is this treaty going to be about, and I'll tell you what those 4 elements are in a moment. And the next thing was, well, how do we start figuring out what kinds of elements are going to be in the text of this treaty? We need to have at least some background of that before we move to the final convention or final intergovernmental conference that produces a new convention, a new treaty. So it's a long process of negotiation for a new treaty. Finally, in July 2017, the preparatory committees produced elements of a draft text. So this is not a draft text, it's elements of the draft text. And they recommended to the UN General Assembly to form an intergovernmental conference. And on the end of last year, on December 24th, there was a decision to move forward with an intergovernmental conference with a time frame of simply as soon as possible. And that's starting and happening this year, and this September I'll be in New York at the Intergovernmental Conference. There's actually an organizational meeting coming up in a few weeks, and the goal is to have a new treaty by mid-2020. If you're interested in following this on social media, the High Seas Alliance tweets about this all the time, and this way to treaty is their sort of tagline. So if you're interested in following this treaty process from afar, check them out. So the package deal components, we have to figure out the legal forum. Actually, that's proved really contentious. Of course, the UN is not a ratified party to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So how this new convention relates as kind of an umbrella to the overarching agreement and still needs to be worked out. But the 4 key elements are marine genetic resource exploitation and particularly benefit sharing from marine genetic resources. Area-based management tools, including marine protected areas. So how do we write the rules for designating marine protected areas on the high seas? Environmental impact assessments. How many people are NEPA fans, right? We have our environmental impact statements in the United States. The provisions for how we do environmental impact assessments are really, really important. How ought we create an institution to assess the environmental impacts of any proposed actions taking place on the high seas in a way that serves the goals of a convention and the objectives of a convention? And finally, this issue of capacity building and technology transfer. Key issues that have really cropped up and not really fully been dealt with, relations with mandates for existing institutions. How does this relate to the IWC? How does this relate to the International Seabed Authority or the regional fisheries management organizations? A conflict of principles, always interesting in international law when you have a conflict of principles, but we have this common heritage principle that under UNCLOS. And we also have this sort of freedom of access issue. You know, are the high seas held in trust under common heritage for humankind? And what does that mean for how we share the benefits of the high seas? So benefit sharings, equity and justice issues, and a question of whether there's any kind of regional approach or what the international approach should be. All of these have have sort of reared their heads in the process of the PrepCom negotiations that took place last year. There are some agreed principles in the elements of the draft text. A precautionary approach, an ecosystem approach, a science-based approach, an integrated approach, a building resilience to climate change, which I'm gonna just say approach, because I think it's at that stage. Everything in this has had to do with how do we build resilience of the high seas to climate change, and an adaptive management approach. We'll be familiar with all of these, but how they all relate to each other in the process of the final form has not yet been worked out. So where are animals in the draft elements? Well, the word species is used once, right there. That's it. And this is the draft elements for area-based management tools, or MPAs. These are the sort of criteria that countries have agreed on that could be used as criteria for the designation or identification of area-based management. Uniqueness, rarity, special importance for life history stages of species is very important. Importance for threatened, endangered, or declining species and or habitats is also very important. These words matter a lot. They're not set in stone yet, but this is how the progress that came out of the preparatory meetings. And you'll notice there's economic and social factors here at the bottom. There were arguments to make that figure more prominently, but there's a really strong ecological and biological component to the ideas behind the designation of ABMTs in the draft elements right now. Marine genetic resources and benefit sharing. Access to marine genetic resources. This is the text that we have in the draft elements. The text would address access. Hasn't gone so well. Intellectual property rights is a very big issue, right? There's a lot of bioprospecting, the same kind of bioprospecting that we saw in rainforests where genetic resources were taken and used in pharmaceutical companies. And here it simply says the text could set out the relationship between the instrument and intellectual property rights. So there's definitely a sense that we're going into the Intergovernmental Conference without a lot of these things necessarily fully baked or worked out yet. Environmental impact statements. There are many provisions of this, and you can go and read the draft elements. I encourage you, if you're into sort of thinking about text in international environmental law. Description of the potential effects of planned activities on the marine environment, including cumulative impacts and any transboundary impacts. So cumulative impacts makes it in there explicitly, which is of course something we think a lot about when it comes to noise pollution for cetaceans. Because exposure to a single event that maybe doesn't reach a threshold is a big question if you have repeated long-term duration exposures to sub-threshold decibels of noise. Given that shipping in international waters is a major concern, thinking about the environmental impact assessment provisions and what they mean for noise pollution regulations on the high seas for cetacean species is definitely part of this conversation as well. So what to expect from what's being called the Paris Agreement for the ocean? Contentious negotiations on principles for benefit sharing, fisheries, and RFMO interactions. There's basically been a decision to not take international fisheries away from the RFMOs. That's not altogether surprising for those of us who think about and study international environmental agreements, and lots of geopolitics over exploitation. There's an interesting opportunity here for integrative, adaptive management and cumulative impacts, issues of equity and justice and their correlation, benefits of marine wildlife conservation on the high seas. And I know that Sarah is going to be working with students this summer in preparation for September to think about what some of the opportunities and ideas going into the Intergovernmental Conference look like. So I only have like 2 or 3 minutes left. I want to talk to you briefly about the Ross Sea, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk about animals and climate vulnerability assessments. I know we're past 8. And so you might be wondering, do we actually have a high seas MPA already? And the answer is yes. We have a couple high seas MPAs, but one really exciting one that was just recently negotiated in what's known as the last ocean. One of the most pristine ocean environments in the entire world, which is in the Ross Sea, Antarctica, home to Adelie penguins, home to Weddell seals. Weddell seals sound blast their prey, which was discovered only very, very recently, like 2 years ago, which is that they hunt by actually creating the equivalent of a sonic boom underwater, which is just incredible. Under the ice, I shouldn't say just underwater. It's a magical, magical ecosystem. And finally, after years of negotiation, the conflict here was really between those countries that engage in the toothfish fishery. So you might be familiar with toothfish if you've ever seen Chilean sea bass. There's no such thing as Chilean sea bass. It's a toothfish. It's a really giant fish, prey of the Weddell seal and victim of the sonic booms. You have fishing countries, South Korea, Russia, Ukraine, and others that fish for toothfish in Antarctic waters. And you have countries interested in conserving the last ocean. Here is the Ross Sea, in particular New Zealand, Australia, and the United States. And for many years, they went back and forth in the negotiations under something called CAMLAR, which came out of the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources and is negotiated through the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. So there's already a treaty instrument here in this area where they're abandoned or suspended sovereign claims in the exclusive economic zone. So essentially, this is the exclusive economic zone of Antarctica, but Antarctica's international, so it's an international MPA. And why do we pay so much attention to it? Well, this process serves as a model for what area-based management tools on the high seas might look like. And it certainly lays out the sort of trials and tribulations of administering a marine protected area. And it's a very simplistic case here because you basically have fishing country interests and conservation interests, and that's pretty much it. It's way more complicated when you think about the whole high seas. But it still took a long time here. But eventually they got there through a principle of precaution. This is a paper that a colleague of mine and I just recently submitted. And it basically started out with a few early innovators who pushed these ideas, New Zealand, Australia, Belgium, the US, and the UK, eventually getting the Russians and the Chinese, Ukraine, and Japan, and the Koreans on board. After 5 years of intensive negotiation. It's a really exciting story because this is a pretty magical and special place. So if you'll permit me, I just want to talk about climate vulnerability assessments for one quick second. Is that cool with everyone? Okay. So we assess climate risk like this. We think about the hazard of climate change, we think about our exposure to that hazard, and we think about our social vulnerability or adaptive capacity. So think of this as warming temperatures or rising seas, the physical infrastructure that's exposed to those rising seas, or the crops that wilt under high temperatures. We need to know what those temperatures are, what it affects that matters to us, and our ability to deal with that. And this has become a major concern from a climate justice perspective. Those who contribute to the least to greenhouse gas emissions are and will be the most impacted by climate change. We know that. I'm going to skip that. But this has led to a whole kind of cottage industry of social vulnerability indices, where we try to figure out how do we measure the adaptive capacity of communities, their ability to withstand the hazard and exposure combination. Because ultimately, our risk and where we want to prioritize investment in enhancing resilience to climate change is in communities, and coastal communities in particular, that are the most vulnerable to exposure to the hazard and therefore most at risk. So we measure social vulnerability in complex ways. Sometimes we go and talk to people and talk about how can they withstand disasters. We look at their education levels, their poverty levels, but really it's more than just demographic information. It's about social cohesion and the ability of a community to be connected to each other. And so when we think about this, I think we should start thinking about not just the vulnerability of populations in a purely scientific sense to climate change, because of course we can assess climate risk in terms of whether the population is going to be able to adapt when we think about genetics. I think we should talk about the social vulnerability of highly complex cetacean societies. We know that from the presentation you heard before that orcas have complex social cultures, right? So we think a lot about standing of non-human animals in a legal sense. There's a tremendous amount of focus on social vulnerability and sort of behavior when we think about how human communities respond to changes. And I think we need to start applying some of those tools to our engagement in thinking about cetacean societies as well. That actually I should credit a student of mine named Holland Haverkamp. He's writing a paper on this idea, and this is his idea in the class he's writing on, and I just think it's so awesome that I wanted to share it at this event as well. So with that, thanks so much.
right, so we have about 25 minutes, so if we could have all the panelists come up, and then we'll do questions, and Anna, you want people to do, yeah, the mic is in the back, so if you have questions, go ahead and filter up. And then for students that, as the panelists are getting back up here, as Erin mentioned, if you're considering taking ocean and coastal law this summer, here's a little plug to take it. So Dawn is going to be teaching, I'm going to be teaching, and Tim Eichenberg is going to be teaching. And for the week that I'm going to be teaching, one of the things that we're going to be able to do is have an opportunity to help prepare the High Seas Advisor for the IUCN for the negotiations in September. So it will be a unique opportunity to work on a real project, and of course, have Dawn as a professor. Later in the summer, if you have availability, Dr. Rowley is going to be teaching a portion of the animal welfare, the new animal welfare law class, which is going to be awesome. So check out the summer catalog, and you can see that online as well. All right, thanks.
Okay, so my question is, from each of your perspectives, where do you see the disconnect between the legal policy side and the scientific side? What's the biggest area where they fail to come together? Sorry.
Someone coming from heavily the science side, it's very variable in terms of what framework you're working within. So where I have had success in Florida, in terms of having the lemon sharks prohibited, I've had zero success at the federal level, and I don't think that will ever happen. And I don't think it's necessarily justified. Working in the Bahamas is really nice because there's a lower level of stakeholders, a smaller government, and a more open process in terms of uptake. We're actually publishing a paper at the moment that looks at that example of the lemon sharks in Florida, an Arctic fishery, a halibut fishery in Cambridge Bay? Cambridge Bay, where they're able to actually move a management line based on 1 year of acoustic data because of the importance of that fishery to the Inuit people. And then the Pacific salmon fishery, and years and years and years of work that has been done there on the salmon that would basically change, from a scientific perspective, conclusively change the survival rates of recreational fisheries, for example, that nothing has been happened because there's so many stakeholder groups and it's such a complex system. Also, the value of the fishery is much higher. Whereas in Florida with the lemon sharks, the value of fishery was in the hundreds of thousands. The papers weren't even published, and that data was used to change policy. In the Arctic, again, the paper was not published. The data was there, but not published because of the importance of that fishery to the Inuit. It was uptaken. But in the salmon fishery, it's a multi-million-dollar fishery, recreational, commercial, many stakeholders. It's a lot harder to get science into policy in those circumstances. Not completely answering your question. I think also often I think it's getting a lot better now, and I see what you guys think about this as well. There used to be a much bigger disconnect between scientists and policymakers and lawmakers and lawyers, and I think people over the years through trial and error realized that there needs to be a lot more cooperation if anything's to happen. And the problems we're faced with, the global biodiversity extinction that we're being faced with, it's forcing, I think, the hand of people to work together to be more efficient in policy and management.
Yeah, I think he touched on this in my realm, which is quite a bit different than strictly the conservation realm when it comes to protecting animals in a captive setting. For example, stakeholders, yeah, it is ultimately where you have, in your government agencies in particular, on some level they are very interested in really, in being fair, ultimately, and being fair. We have status quos that hinder progress, and literally I mentioned during my talk that APHIS just put forth a proposed rule in 2016 to amend the Animal Welfare Act regulations for marine mammals. As an example of this, they actually reached out directly to the experts in the field on both sides, and this was 14 plus years prior to when they actually published this rule, so quite some time ago, and asked them what they think is fair, what is even, animal welfare experts and people who have no interest in seeing marine mammals in captivity realize that these animals are there, and so how can you set an ideal size of a tank for an orca? I mean, how can you do that? But they did, and they came together and they looked at the resources, they looked at the literature, and they presented that to APHIS, and unfortunately, the majority of those recommendations were not followed. And the really frustrating bit of that is actually that in the proposed rule, it specifically mentions that there isn't scientific literature to support increasing the size of an orca's tank. And I'm sorry, but that is just flat out wrong. And that it was handed to them 14 years prior. So you can imagine all of the abundance of literature that's been published since then. So, of course, the response from the animal community has been thorough in presenting them with all of that. And, so it's, I think it's challenging to get them there. It's challenging, and that's why I work with lawyers, because I think it's really, it's incredible how effective we can be together. And I'm really disappointed that there aren't more veterinarians working in this capacity, multidisciplinary with lawyers and policy and campaigns and everything else. But I hope that will change, and I think it is. I see a lot of veterinarians who are in school right now reaching out to me, looking for, they don't teach us this in vet school. How do I get there? And so it is changing. It's going to change. But yeah, stakeholders, long story short, I think that's where you see most of the hindrance and most of the hesitation, I think, to move things forward, and to reference scientific literature that exists that supports that. So.
Just to follow up on some of that scientific literature, there's a whole field of sustainability science that studies the pathways that successfully lead from scientific knowledge to action. And that empirical work that studies tons of science policy cases basically concludes that how information is produced, it has to be credible and sort of science-based. When we say science-based, we mean credible, peer-reviewed, expert-based. It has to be salient, it has to be relevant to the question, but increasingly, most importantly, it has to be viewed by the decision maker as legitimate. And legitimacy has to do with a process of fairness and stakeholder engagement. And this is why you see a lot of emphasis on participatory or collaborative models for decision making, right? And it's not always the case. It's not always the case that collaboration leads to a better result. In many cases, collaboration is sort of this grand compromise of bringing competing views. And so what do we say when we say better result, right? Well, this is sometimes not always that well held of a view, but I firmly believe that science never tells us what to do, right? As a society, we judge our values, and our values, as represented in a political sphere, tell us what to do, because that's what we want to do. But it has to be science-based. What does that mean? That means that we have to have evidence that we can bring to bear, and the frustrating cases are the ones where we have, this decision that's represented in our statute or in the implementation of the law, and we have science-based support for that, like we heard about with the distinct population segments before, and then ultimately that decision at that level is not made. But I have a tremendous amount of hope for this. I came out of an interdisciplinary program, PhD program. I had 2 lawyers and 2 scientists and a sociologist on my PhD committee, and everyone told me, you'll never get a job. Everyone said, who are you? You don't know what you are. And ultimately, I think those kinds of programs are increasingly successful, that people who work closely between scientists, economists, lawyers, anthropologists, conservationists, veterinarians, that everyone working together, this sort of new generation and new approach is ultimately going to lead to a circumstance where people speak multiple languages. They're not fluent in all of them, right? But they speak multiple languages. If you speak multiple languages, you understand enough about the science, you understand enough about the law if you're a scientist to know what matters. And if you can speak multiple languages, we're gonna change the world.
So I would say there's 3 different levels to answer your question, and thank you, it's a very good question. The first is that, especially in the ocean and marine wildlife area, these are really the frontiers of science. And there is so much that is not known. When you look back at the Marine Mammal Protection Act, for example, in 1972, Congress said in formulating the requirements of that act is we really don't know what is going on. There's so much we don't know about marine mammals. And that's still the case. It is incredible how much there is to learn about the oceans. So the first level is just getting the science done. And that's not easy. And it's especially not easy now because so much of the funding for the science in these areas, in the environmental areas, comes from the federal government, and we know what's happening there. So it's from my experience in working with scientists and with agencies that depend on science, is that they're losing their funding. The scientists that work for the agencies are leaving either because they have to or they just don't want to work in the current political environment. So first level is getting the science done, figuring out what are the questions we need to answer and how do we get them answered. Second level is, and this is Aaron's point, is, well, okay, once you get that, what do you do with it? In October, I went up to Halifax and I attended the biennial conference on the biology of marine mammals. And it was amazing. Heather was there. How many, it was kind of like going to the Final Four. You go in this big auditorium to hear the keynote speeches, and there was thousands of people. And these are scientists who are working on it. So there's definitely and many of them are grad students or undergrads who are just really, really interested in this area. So the interest is there. Once you get the science, how do you translate that into action? And Aaron's point is very important, that depends on, it's driven in so many cases by stakeholders. And I think that's especially true now, that depending on the NGO community and academic institutions to identify, okay, we've got some science now on some of these issues that are at the frontiers of science. Here's what we need to do with it. The final level is, once that happens, and the general principle that's applied under most federal laws in this area is you follow a precautionary principle, and you err on the side of being conservative, and you err on being, in the case of marine wildlife, err on the side of protecting the species. So once you have identified what needs to be done and you've applied those principles, then, and we talked about this in the listing case for the southern residents, then you have to worry about the political level. And this is where I think the disconnect is. I think we can get through the first two levels in many cases, but where we really want to watch out for the disconnect is where the result that the information generated, the science produces, going through the filter of public involvement and collaboration, saying here's some things that needs to be done, then that has to be accepted at the political level. And very often that's not the case. If for those of you who've taken the ocean law course, or if you take it this summer, you'll see we read case after case after case, like CBD v. Lawn that Sarah briefed for us, where the science is there, there's general agreement what needs to happen, and then there's a political dimension that comes in and says, well, we're just not going to do it because we don't like the result. And then you end up in court.
And just very quickly again on that, some of the best advice I got as a scientist is someone once said to me, science should be policy relevant, not policy prescriptive. And historically, scientists, we're a very arrogant bunch. We traditionally would say, we have demonstrated this, therefore you must change this, and that's not the way to work together to get things done. That really gets people's backs up. I hope we're moving more towards a more unified approach.
I have two questions. First, who are the major drivers in the driver's seat of pushing forward ocean and marine mammal conservation, whether it's governments, NGOs, or politicians throughout the world? And secondly, how are we helping communities to teach them sort of compassion and understanding that these marine protected areas are very important to not only their own biodiversity and sustainability, but also total ocean biodiversity and sustainability.
Yeah, sure. I can start with that, and thanks so much for the question. It's a really great question. At the UN Ocean Conference, where there's sort of the state of play of the major drivers in conservation, in ocean conservation, it's the big NGOs and the philanthropic foundations, to be honest, working together with particular countries with whom they work closely. So, you know, Pew and IUCN, CI, Conservation International, Nature Conservancy, the Packard Foundation, Moore Foundation. That's where the conversation comes from. They're pushing the initiatives and they're pushing the money. And in part, it's related to something that Don said earlier, which is, you know, a lot of the money for these big initiatives is coming from foundations now, not from federal governments. So I think if you're interested in kind of reading the tea leaves of where things go in terms of ocean conservation writ large, I'm not speaking particularly to marine wildlife issues, but I think there's a lot of action there. In answer to your second question, you know, can you repeat the second question actually? So I was wondering. Communities, right, thanks. So some of the big initiatives for large-scale MPAs and exclusive economic zones have really made a distinction between commercial fisheries and commercial interaction and artisanal fisheries or small-scale fisheries. So I think one thing we're seeing is a bifurcation in management of fishing that has a long legacy in terms of if we think about commercial whale harvesting and the moratorium under the IWC and the provisions for Aboriginal and Indigenous whaling, that it's not necessarily just Aboriginal and Indigenous, but when it comes to MPA implementation, involvement of communities and fishers is A, important, going back to our previous conversation about stakeholders, but B, that there is a big distinction between shark sanctuaries and large-scale commercial fishing MPAs like we've seen in Palau, where Palau also has a provision to continue to allow Palauan communities their traditional fishing grounds and rights. And I think the consciousness of that is not uniform. It's not all over the place. Enforcement for some of the species-focused sanctuaries, sharks and ray sanctuaries, is a big issue, as Steve spoke about before. But all of the evidence points to that the more involvement you have with communities, the more we're able to come up with a sustainable future where there's buy-in, and that things that are kind of forced from the top down don't always work that well. I hope that answers a little bit of the question.
I want to thank you for that communities question, because it is absolutely essential when it comes to every conservation issue that we're dealing with in terms of a landscape conservation issue, that communities are the driving factor, local communities, Indigenous communities in particular. And that is, we've all been discussing, like, this is, we largely are working on policy levels, we're working on, top-down approaches, and there is a place for that. But where it fails is when communities, it's not viable on the ground for one reason or another, whether it's an educational barrier or a demographic barrier, whatever demographic barrier there is. I don't know if any of you have seen Racing Extinction, which is a film that I worked on for 8 years, and we were working primarily on manta ray gills and the sale of manta ray gills, hunting of mantas in primarily these are small communities, and these are people who that are they've stepped into a fortune now that these animals they're actually profiting off of the animals' decline, the extinction of a species, and that's what we're seeing on a individual species level in these markets. And flipping that, we do have examples of ecotourism where you can you can demonstrate that this animal is worth so much more money alive than dead, and you can implement for a lot of these places, it's infrastructure. They don't even have, they don't have infrastructure for ecotourism. They don't have a building for people to, a hotel, or, a building to operate out of in any way. And so we've been on the ground in a small village in Lamakera in Indonesia, and that's one of the sort of centers for manta ray in particular. Gill hunting, manta ray hunting, and they're primarily used, the gills are lucrative on the Asian market. And we've been able to, by working on the ground, this is largely Vulcan actually has been heavily involved in funding a lot of that, and sending in, one of the first steps has been sending in sort of researchers and people who are interested in working with this fisherman to get out on the boats and actually do, get into the water and do these assessments and do their work. So taking and of course researchers and interns, and they don't have as much infrastructure need as, say, someone who's paying a lot of money to go on a nice vacation. So it's a way that has helped build that infrastructure for them, injecting some funding into it and building it from kind of the ground up. And what we've seen, people want to do this, but they have nothing else on this island. They have nothing else to sustain them, really. They don't have any agriculture. So the manta ray gills put their children through school, and they need to have another outlet to make money. And we've seen now that they've seen that if they've, a lot of them had never even gotten in the ocean and swam with a manta, and now they've gotten in and they are falling in love with them, and they are seeing that people want this experience and will pay for it. And the community has come without being forced from the outside in, although there are laws regulating this, so they really shouldn't be doing it. But you know how enforcement is on the ground. But they've actually come to their own place. A part of the community, one group of fishermen has just determined and mandated that the entire village will no longer engage in this. And it's because they were out on a boat doing research and non-invasive research and ecotourism type activities with these whales, and another boat came, or whales in my brain, manta rays, and another boat came by and speared a manta right in front of them. And it was a turning point for them, and they, so help people. People want to do this. You just have to find, it takes time, it takes investment, it takes creativity, but it has to happen from the ground up or it will not be sustainable in the long term, and that's what we need. That's what conservation is. So, sorry for the long.
I just want to use an example because it can tie into the first question that we had. And this is coming back domestically. There are currently 13 national marine sanctuaries in the United States, 14 if you include Papahanaumokuakea National Monument. No national marine sanctuaries have been designated in the United States for decades. And that's because it requires, under the traditional model, a political approach with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration identifying a place they want to go, identifying what the sanctuary will be, drawing the boundaries, going to Congress, trying to get it done through Congress, and that just doesn't happen. So a few years ago, NOAA came up with a new model, which is let's do bottom up. Let's come up with a process where the recommendation for the sanctuary will come from the community. The community has to develop some level of consensus, high degree of consensus that this is worth doing. Then we will accept that proposal as a recommendation for us to move it through the system. And by the time we get to Congress, nobody can complain because this is what the community, what the voters, what the folks back in the district say that they want. So that proposal came out. Final regulation said, here's the system. And the response was really incredible, that within the first year, there were probably a dozen different recommendations that came from different communities all around the country, from Florida to the Aleutian Islands. They weren't all exactly in the right form. They didn't all have the right level of consensus, but as that process continued to work through the system, there ended up with a number that are still in the works, but two that actually made it to a point where they were accepted for moving forward through formal nomination. One is an area in Chesapeake Bay, the other is an area in Lake Michigan, which would focus primarily on shipwrecks. Strong local community support. Everybody thought it was great. was recognized by President Obama. This is the right thing to do. And it was moving forward under this administration. So both of those were basically taken as these will be the next places included as national marine sanctuaries in the United States. We just have to get through the process. 3 weeks ago, out of the blue, Scott Walker, the governor of Wisconsin, came forward and said, I don't like this sanctuary in Lake Michigan. Never said why, and that was the end of the process. So it wasn't really science in the disconnect, it was the disconnect between the community saying we want to do this and the policymaker who mattered the most, because under this system, it requires, if you don't have the governor on board, you don't have the state on board, you're not gonna make it across the finish line. But anyway, the notion of switch the model, start with the community, do bottom up, get to the top, but then watch out for that political element, because it can still jump in at the end and derail what's otherwise a very good idea.
Hi, my question's a bit of a follow-up from before. What is the role of scientific uncertainty in crafting legal protections for these animals? I'm thinking specifically of offshore wind turbines and their impacts on marine wildlife, and how there's a lot of correlation between the scientific data and the impacts on the species, but not a lot of causation as of yet. So what legal protections can be done while waiting for that conclusive scientific evidence?
So there are a couple different principles that are at stake here. One is, as I already mentioned, that typically there will be a go slow approach applied to making decisions that will have an adverse impact on a protected species of some sort, where all of the information is not available. That's the precautionary principle. So that's usually at play. When you get into a situation like renewable energy, where there is a very strong environmental goal that is to be advanced, and sometimes you can have a collision between how are we going to apply the precautionary principle and how are we going to advance forward offshore wind projects or some other form of solar energy projects that we just, because those technologies have not been deployed on a commercial scale, especially in an environment like the ocean, you just don't really know what the impacts will be. And that's where another scientific principle comes in that's very important, that is more and more being embraced on the legal side, and that's adaptive management, which is, we will set in place some checks and balances that as a particular project goes forward, we can check in, we can see what's happening. And if it's necessary to make changes in the nature of the legal authorizations and restrictions that apply to a particular development, that can be done, but that's incorporated at the outset of decision-making rather than wait until information comes forward that shows that it's already too late. So when the system works, those two basic approaches, precautionary principle to be careful to get there. When there's uncertainty, apply adaptive management so you can retool. Those will be incorporated.
Oh, is that my turn? Oh, hi. Dr. Kessel spoke about sustainable fisheries for shark fins and stuff like that. But there are other people that would oppose even that from an ethical viewpoint rather than a scientific basis. So my question is, should the ethical viewpoints have the same weight as the scientific facts? And I understand that may be an unfair question, but why not end on a spicy note?
I might have been a little unclear on some of that. Those sustainable fisheries are not fin fisheries. They are fins intact. They're landing the whole animal, and the whole animal is used. They're not discarding the carcasses at sea. There was one exemption to the fins intact rule, which was for this smooth hound, I think. And that I said it's possibly because it's very sustainable, so they're not as worried. But I don't think that's leading to the process of finning in the U.S. fishery. That's still illegal. I can't tell. I don't know the complete details of that. Just to confirm that.
Great question. So I would say, and I say this to people a lot because I think that a lot of times working for the organization that I do and being a part of really the animal rights movement and being vegan myself, I absolutely act primarily myself from an ethical standpoint. Every decision that I make, I have to feel good about. I have to go to bed at night feeling good about it. But when you're talking about big picture conservation management of the planet, it's a bit more challenging. But generally speaking, what I find is that at least far more so than it is being employed now, we need to marry those two concepts. There's not a void between science and welfare, or good conservation and animal welfare outcomes. And the more that I find that we are starting to do that, the more I think we are effective at conservation. Because usually the more humane answer is also the more sustainable one, if that makes sense. And even when you're talking about, I have no illusion that tomorrow fishing will still be happening. So speaking of fishing, like we're not gonna end it, it's not gonna stop. How can it be done more humanely? And so talking about, the experience of the animal, like I started out discussing with orcas, how can we think about this from the animal's perspective and look at, and we've discussed supporting, less small scale artisanal fisheries, for example. And typically there's far less bycatch associated with a lot of those industries. There's far less animal impact, and that of course has a welfare implication, right? So they're not divorced. I don't have an answer for you because I think that's something everyone has to decide for themselves, and that's just how you behave on a day-to-day basis. It's determined by that and your position on it. But ultimately, I do think that there really is a need for marrying these two concepts because they're really not opposed, and they have been sort of presented that way and seem to be butting heads and at odds, but we can find common ground in them, and when we do, that's usually where we find the solutions. So I would advocate more of that.
Great. I don't actually have a question. I'm unfortunately going to cut us off at that. But thank you all so much for coming and speaking on these issues. They're so important. Thank you, everybody, for coming and watching. We unfortunately don't have any more food, otherwise I'd offer it. But there might be some more fried wontons on the table, so eat those. So we're done. So thank everybody for coming.